Hey guys, Luke here again. So this one's going to be a backroom story. Not sure if you're going to like it or not. I do, and I will probably always love the backrooms, so I had to make one, a long one. It's a project I started last year, funny enough, but I didn't really like it. There's also like the main character, Lucas, of course, like all of the other stories. There's also Sarah's part of the story. You'll see when you listen to it. Uh, I haven't recorded Sarah's part yet. I'm not sure if I will, because yes, both stories would go well together, but they kind of diverge. Basically, like if you know the backrooms, you know how timeline works and stuff. So, well, anyways, if you like it, leave a like. If you don't, tell me what I could have done better, I guess. Um, but yeah, have fun, have a good one, and enjoy listening. Peace out.
A lone wanderer's descent into the backrooms. The Wanderer's Log of Lucas. Chapter 1. The Unwitting Entry. Lucas was a creature of habit and order, a man who found comfort in the quiet, dusty aisles of the university's Special Collections Archive. His life was a carefully curated catalog of historical documents and forgotten manuscripts. The world outside, with its noise and chaos, was a place he tolerated rather than inhabited. His sanctuary was the scent of aging paper, the gentle creak of wooden floorboards, and the soft glow of the green-shaded lamp on his desk. On that particular Tuesday, he was wrestling with a behemoth of a filing cabinet, a relic from the early 20th century, trying to coax a jammed drawer open to retrieve a set of pre-war architectural blueprints. He gave it one last, frustrated tug. The drawer flew open, but the cabinet, top-heavy and unbalanced, tipped. Time seemed to warp and stretch. He remembered the screech of metal against the floor, a cascade of manila folders fluttering down like wounded birds, and the distinct, gut-wrenching sensation of falling. It wasn't the sharp, breathless plunge of gravity, but a slow, syrupy descent, as if the very floor had dissolved into nothingness beneath him. He didn't hit the ground, he simply arrived. The transition was seamless and utterly disorienting. He was on his back, the hard, polished wood of the archive replaced by a damp, spongy surface. A wave of nausea rolled through him as he pushed himself up, his hand sinking slightly into the squelching, beige carpet. The air was thick and stagnant, carrying a cloying, chemical odor like mildewed fabric and ozone. Above him, a grid of fluorescent lights stretched into an incomprehensible distance, each one flickering at its own maddening, asynchronous rhythm. Their hum was not a gentle background noise, but a pervasive, invasive thrum that vibrated deep in his skull, a dentist's drill in the soul. The walls, a nauseating shade of mono yellow, were stained with dark, ambiguous patterns that could have been water damage or the ghostly imprints of something long decayed. There were no windows. There were no doors. There were no clocks, no fire alarms, no distinguishing features of any kind. Every corridor looked identical. Every corner turned led to a space indistinguishable from the one he had just left. He called out, his voice sounding small and pathetic, swallowed by the oppressive hum. The only answer was the echo of his own rising panic. He started walking, a brisk, purposeful stride that he hoped would lead him back to the familiar archive. But the geometry of this place was a lie. He walked in what he felt was a straight line for what seemed like an hour, only to find the scuff mark his own shoe had made on the damp carpet when he first woke up. He tried retracing his steps, meticulously counting his paces, but the path behind him seemed to rewrite itself, leading him to yet another identical, soulless room. This was level 0, the lobby, a place where the laws of physics had been written by a madman. It was a sterile, infinite loop of mundane architecture designed to break the mind. A profound, chilling sense of isolation began its insidious creep into the corners of his mind. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone, a forgotten file in an archive that stretched into infinity. Chapter 2. The Onset of Madness. The concept of time dissolved into a meaningless blur. The relentless hum of the fluorescent lights was his sun and moon, their constant, flickering glare erasing the cycle of day and night. Lucas's meticulously ordered mind, accustomed to schedules and deadlines, began to fray at the edges. Was it his second day? His fifth? He had no way of knowing. His wristwatch had stopped, its hands frozen at the moment he fell. Hunger started as a familiar pang but soon morphed into a hollow, gnawing ache that consumed his thoughts. He fantasized about the simple pleasure of a sandwich, the taste of coffee, the crisp bite of an apple. His throat was a desert, a raw, parched landscape of thirst. He'd eyed the murky, dark liquid that stained the carpet, the source of the ever-present dampness, but a primal instinct screamed at him that drinking it would be a fatal mistake. His body began to betray him. His steps became a weary shuffle, his thoughts grew sluggish and disjointed. The sensory deprivation was a form of torture more subtle and cruel than any physical pain. The unblinking yellow walls, the monotonous hum, the single, repulsive texture of the carpet, it was a prison designed to strip away his sanity layer by layer. His mind, starved of new stimuli, began to create its own. He started hearing things. At first it was faint, like whispers just on the edge of hearing, a language he couldn't place, full of sibilant, wet sounds. Then came the scuttling noises from within the walls, the frantic scratching of 1,000 tiny claws. He would spin around, heart hammering in his chest, to find nothing but the same empty, yellow corridor stretching into the humming void. Hallucinations became his only companions. He would see a perfectly normal-looking oak door appear at the end of a long hallway, its brass handle gleaming. Hope would surge through him, a powerful, intoxicating wave, and he would break into a desperate, stumbling run, only for the door to flicker and dissolve into the familiar, stained wallpaper just as he reached for it. He once saw a grand staircase, spiraling upwards into darkness. He climbed for what felt like hours, his legs burning with effort, before realizing he had not ascended at all. He was standing on the same step he had started on, the staircase looping back on itself in an impossible Escher-like construction. The buzzing of the lights became a malevolent entity in itself. It would swell in volume to a deafening roar that forced him to his knees, hands clamped over his ears, before cutting to an abrupt, terrifying silence that was somehow even more maddening. In these silent moments, the whispers would return, clearer now, seeming to mock his despair. He was losing himself, the archivist named Lucas becoming a ghost haunting a yellow hell of his own mind's creation. Chapter 3: The Glimmer of Hope. Sanity had become a slippery, elusive thing, a memory of a life that felt increasingly like a dream. Lucas had slumped against a wall, his body a trembling mess of exhaustion and hunger, his mind a turbulent sea of auditory and visual phantoms. He was tracing the ugly brown water stains on the wallpaper, a mindless activity to tether himself to some semblance of physical reality, when he noticed it. In the endless, soul-crushing ocean of uniformity, there was an island of difference. One section of the wall, about the size of a doorway, was subtly wrong. The yellow was a shade darker, a jaundiced, sickly hue compared to the rest, and the texture seemed to shimmer, to vibrate at a frequency just beyond normal perception. His heart, which had been beating a slow, funereal rhythm, gave a painful lurch. It was probably another hallucination, another cruel trick of his starving brain. He had learned to distrust hope. Hope was the bait in the trap of this place, but he couldn't ignore it. He crawled towards it, the squelch of the carpet beneath his knees a wet, rhythmic count. He reached out a trembling hand, half expecting it to meet the solid, slightly damp surface of the wall. Instead, his fingers met no resistance. They passed through the wallpaper as if it were a projection, a hologram of a physical barrier. A cold, tingling sensation like static electricity enveloped his hand. He pulled it back, staring at his fingers as if they belonged to someone else. They looked normal, solid. He had to be hallucinating, but the discolored patch remained. He remembered, in a flash of clarity from a life before, scrolling through late-night internet forums, reading about urban legends and creepypastas. The Backrooms, a name he dismissed as fanciful fiction. But one detail had stuck in his memory, the concept of no clipping, of accidentally falling through the boundaries of reality. And if you could fall in, maybe, just maybe, you could fall through again. Fear and hope waged a violent war in his chest. This could be a gateway to something worse, a deeper level of hell. But staying here was a slow, guaranteed death of the mind and body. The humming of the lights seemed to crescendo, as if urging him on, mocking his hesitation. With a guttural cry that was equal parts terror and desperation, he lunged forward, pushing his entire body at the shimmering, discolored wall. The sensation was indescribable, a nauseating lurch as reality itself seemed to peel back around him. For a moment he was nowhere, a disembodied consciousness in a void of roaring static and flashing colors. Then, with a sudden, violent shunt, he was somewhere else. Chapter 4: The Treacherous Promise of the Habitable Zone. Lucas tumbled out of the non-space, landing hard on a cold, unyielding surface. He gasped, his lungs burning as they took in air that was thick with the metallic tang of rust and the earthy smell of concrete and decay. He was no longer in the yellow purgatory. The world here was a study in brutalist architecture and industrial neglect. He was in a long, cavernous corridor made of rough, gray concrete. The floor was slick with a thin film of grimy water, and a dense network of pipes and electrical conduits snaked along the walls and ceiling like metallic vines. The maddening hum of the yellow room's lights was gone, replaced by the low, resonant thrum of distant machinery, the rhythmic clanking of unseen mechanisms, and the steady, maddening drip-drip-drip of water echoing from somewhere in the oppressive darkness. This was Level 1, a place whispered about in the fragmented lore he could recall as the habitable zone. The name itself was a cruel irony. While less immediately hostile to the psyche than Level 0, it radiated a palpable sense of physical danger. The darkness was not complete. A dim, ambient light, seemingly emanating from the very walls, cast long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed at the edge of his vision. Every shadow could conceal a threat. He got to his feet, his body aching from the fall. Thirst, his constant tormentor, was the first priority. Following the sound of dripping water, he found a section where condensation beaded on a large, cold pipe, gathering and falling in a steady rhythm into a murky puddle. He hesitated, but the thirst was an agony he could no longer bear. He cupped his hands and drank the cool, metallic-tasting water. It was the most exquisite thing he had ever tasted. For the first time in days, a sliver of genuine, unadulterated hope took root. Resources. Survival was possible here. He began to explore, moving with a caution that was entirely new to him. The archivist was gone, replaced by a scavenger. He learned to test the stability of rusted gratings before stepping on them, to listen for changes in the ambient noise of the machinery, to treat every corner as a potential ambush point. The level was a labyrinth of maintenance tunnels, boiler rooms filled with hulking, silent machines, and vast, empty warehouses where the sound of his own breathing seemed deafeningly loud. He found a small, locked supply closet, and using a loose piece of rebar to pry the door open, discovered his first treasure, a dented metal crate. Inside, he found a half-empty bottle of a strange, viscous liquid that smelled faintly of vanilla and almonds, and a stale, foil-wrapped protein bar. He knew from the online legends, this was almond water, a substance said to have restorative and healing properties. He took a small sip. It was sweet, refreshing, and seemed to clear the fog from his mind. He was no longer just a victim, he was a survivor. But this new sense of agency was tempered by a constant, prickling fear. The sounds of the level were not just industrial. Sometimes he would hear a metallic scraping from a parallel tunnel, a wet, dragging sound from the floor above, or a low, guttural chittering that was distinctly organic. He was not alone, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was not at the top of the food chain. Chapter 5: The First Encounter. The relative safety of Level 1 was a comforting lie Lucas had told himself, a flimsy shield against the encroaching dread. He had established a small routine: explore for a few hours, find a defensible spot to rest, drink a small amount of the precious almond water, and nibble at the protein bar, rationing it with a miser's care. He was navigating a particularly dense section of tunnels, where the pipes on the walls were so thick they formed a claustrophobic cage around the narrow walkway. The air grew colder, and the ambient hum of the level was drowned out by a new sound, a wet, rhythmic clicking, accompanied by a low, guttural snarl that seemed to vibrate through the concrete floor. Lucas froze, every nerve ending screaming. He flattened himself against a large, cold pipe, peering into the gloom ahead. At first, he saw only shadows, but then one of the shadows detached itself from the others and began to move. It was a hound, though the name was a pathetic attempt to categorize something so utterly alien. The creature was a nightmarish caricature of a canine, its body a contorted mass of skeletal limbs covered in a dark, leathery hide that seemed to absorb the dim light. Its movements were unnatural, a jerky, twitching gait, and its head swiveled on a long, thin neck, its face a blank slate devoid of eyes or a nose, with only a gaping maw filled with needle-like teeth. The clicking sound was its claws scraping against the concrete. The snarl was the sound of its breathing. Lucas's blood ran cold. This wasn't a hallucination born of a fractured mind. This was a real physical predator. He had read about them, that their vision was based on movement and their hearing was unnaturally acute. He held his breath, praying his heart wasn't beating as loudly as it sounded in his own ears. The hound stopped, its blank face tilting as if sniffing the air. It let out another low growl and took a step in his direction. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He had to move. To his right was a small stack of discarded, rusted crates. It was his only chance. In one desperate, fluid motion, he pushed off the pipe and dove behind the crates, landing silently on the grimy floor. He pulled his legs in, making himself as small as possible, and squeezed his eyes shut. The clicking grew louder. He could hear it sniffing the air, its wet, ragged breaths just on the other side of his flimsy cover. He could smell its foul odor, a mix of rot and ozone. Seconds stretched into agonizing eternities. He focused on staying absolutely still, controlling his breathing, suppressing the tremor that racked his body. Any sound, any movement would mean a swift and brutal death. The creature circled the crates, its claws scraping a terrible, high-pitched screech against the metal. It was hunting. It knew something was there. Then a loud clang echoed from far down the corridor, a loose piece of metal falling from the ceiling. The hound's head snapped in that direction. After a moment of tense silence, it let out a frustrated hiss and began to move away, its clicking footsteps gradually receding into the gloom. Lucas remained frozen for what felt like an hour, every muscle screaming in protest, until the only sound was the familiar drip of water and the thrum of the level. He had survived. The encounter left an indelible mark on him. The psychological horror of Level 0 was one thing, but this was different. This was primal. The Backrooms were not just a prison, they were a hunting ground. Chapter 6: A Fleeting Alliance. In the days following his encounter with the Hound, Lucas's isolation took on a new, more terrifying dimension. Before, he had been alone with his thoughts and the ghosts of his own mind. Now, he was alone with monsters. Every shadow held a potential threat, every distant noise was a predator on the prowl. The crushing weight of solitude was becoming unbearable, a slow-acting poison that made him question if survival was even worth the effort. He was huddled in a small maintenance alcove, nursing the last few sips of his almond water when he heard it. It wasn't the clang of machinery or the chittering of an entity. It was the soft, unmistakable scuff of a rubber-soled shoe against concrete. He instantly went rigid, his hand gripping the piece of rebar he now carried as a crude weapon. He held his breath, listening. The footsteps were cautious, hesitant. They stopped just around the corner from his alcove. A voice, hoarse from disuse, whispered into the gloom, "Is anyone there?" Lucas's heart hammered against his ribs. It could be a trick. Some entities, the lore claimed, could mimic human speech to lure their prey. He remained silent, pressing himself deeper into the shadows. The voice came again, closer this time, laced with a desperate tremor. "Please, I saw your light. I'm not one of them." Light? Lucas glanced down at the small, cheap flashlight he'd found in the supply closet, which he'd forgotten to turn off. It cast a weak, pathetic beam on the floor. It was a beacon that could have drawn any number of horrors to him, but instead it had drawn this. Taking a leap of faith born of sheer desperation, he whispered back, "I'm here." A figure slowly emerged from around the corner. It was a woman, perhaps a few years younger than him, with tired, haunted eyes and clothes that were ripped and stained. She held up her empty hands to show she was unarmed. Her name was Sarah. The relief that washed over Lucas was so profound, it almost brought him to his knees. To see another human face, to hear another human voice that wasn't a hallucination, was like a drowning man finding a piece of driftwood. They talked for hours, their words tumbling out in a rushed, frantic torrent, sharing their stories of how they had fallen into this nightmare. Sarah had been a student who had simply leaned back too far in her chair in the campus library. They pooled their meager resources. She had a small stash of almond water and a half-eaten bag of trail mix. He had his protein bar and flashlight. It wasn't much, but together it felt like a feast. Traveling with Sarah changed the entire dynamic of his existence. The oppressive silence was now filled with conversation. The constant fear was blunted by shared vigilance. They took turns sleeping, one standing guard while the other rested. They navigated the treacherous corridors of Level 1 together, pointing out loose floor panels and potential hiding spots. They were a team. For the first time since he'd arrived, Lucas felt a flicker of something he thought he had lost forever: hope. The backrooms were still a terrifying, deadly maze, but with Sarah by his side, it no longer felt like a solitary confinement. The shared burden of their reality made it, for a short while, almost bearable. Chapter 7: The Inevitable Betrayal. Their fragile alliance was a candle in a hurricane, bright and precious, but destined to be extinguished. For several days, the partnership with Sarah was a lifeline. They moved through the rusting guts of Level 1 with a shared purpose, their combined knowledge of the fragmented online lore giving them a slight edge. They learned to identify the subtle signs of an entity's proximity: a drop in temperature, a specific metallic odor, a change in the ambient hum. The camaraderie was a powerful anesthetic for the constant, underlying terror. But the backrooms are a crucible, a place that burns away everything but the raw, primal instinct to survive. And survival in this place was a zero-sum game. Their resources were dwindling at an alarming rate. The last of the trail mix was gone, the protein bar reduced to a few crumbs in a foil wrapper. The almond water, their most vital asset, was now less than a quarter full in a single bottle. The hunger and thirst returned, no longer a dull ache but a sharp, insistent demand, and with it came the paranoia. It started with small things: a sideways glance when one of them took a sip of water, a hesitation before sharing a scrap of food. The conversations that had once flowed freely became strained and punctuated by long, uncomfortable silences. They began to see threats not just in the shadows but in each other. Each swallow of water the other person took was a swallow that they could not have. Lucas would wake from his watch to find Sarah staring at him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. He, in turn, found himself calculating just how long the remaining water would last for one person versus two. The trust that had been their foundation began to crack and crumble. The breaking point came in a small, cramped pump control room they had decided was safe enough to rest in for a few hours. Lucas, exhausted from his watch, had just drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. He was jolted awake not by a sound but by the subtle feeling of movement. He opened his eyes to see Sarah crouched over his makeshift bag, her hand closing around the bottle of almond water. Their eyes met. In that instant, Lucas saw no trace of the companion he had shared stories and fears with. Her face was a mask of gaunt desperation, her eyes feral. "I need it more, Lucas," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Not as strong as you." She didn't wait for a reply. She scrambled to her feet and bolted for the door. A surge of pure, hot adrenaline coursed through Lucas. He lunged after her, tackling her to the ground just outside the doorway. The bottle flew from her grasp, landing on the concrete with a sickening thud but miraculously not breaking. The struggle was ugly and pathetic. There were no grand pronouncements, just the desperate grunts and scrabbling of two starving animals fighting over a scrap. She clawed at his face and he pushed her away, his only thought to get the water back. He managed to grab the bottle and scrambled backward. Sarah rose to her feet, a dark trickle of blood running from her lip. The look she gave him was one of pure, undiluted hatred. He didn't wait to see what she would do next. He turned and ran, plunging into the dark, labyrinthine corridors, the bitter taste of betrayal a fresh wound on his already scarred soul. He was alone again, but this time, the loneliness was heavier. It was now tainted with the knowledge that the greatest monsters in the backrooms weren't necessarily the ones with claws and teeth. Chapter 8. Ascending to the Electrical Station. The flight from Sarah left Lucas hollowed out, adrift in a sea of renewed despair. The betrayal had reinforced a grim lesson. In the backrooms, trust was a luxury and sentimentality was a liability. He wandered aimlessly for what felt like days, his movements purely automatic, his mind a maelstrom of paranoia and regret. He avoided open spaces, sticking to the tightest, most claustrophobic maintenance tunnels, his rebar held in a white-knuckled grip. It was during this numb, reactive wandering that he stumbled upon the elevator. It was an old, industrial service lift, its steel doors scarred with rust and strange, claw-like markings. Most of the elevators he had encountered were dead, their call buttons dark and unresponsive. But this one had a faint, flickering light behind the up arrow. He had no idea where it led, but anywhere was better than the familiar dread of Level 1, a level now poisoned by the memory of his failed alliance. With a fatalistic shrug, he pressed the button. For a long moment nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protesting metal and a lurch that nearly knocked him off his feet, the elevator began its slow, noisy ascent. The ride was terrifying. The cables strained and creaked and the elevator car shook violently, the sounds echoing the turmoil in his own mind. When the doors finally shuttered open, he was blasted by a wave of intense, dry heat. He had arrived in Level 2, the electrical station. If Level 1 was a world of concrete and rust, Level 2 was a hell of humming machinery and exposed wiring. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and hot metal, and the low thrum of the previous level was replaced by the deafening, omnipresent roar of massive electrical generators and transformers. The entire level was a single, sprawling industrial complex, a maze of narrow metal catwalks suspended over dark, bottomless chasms. Thick bundles of cables, some as thick as his arm, snaked everywhere, occasionally spitting blue sparks. The heat was relentless, sapping his strength and making every breath feel like he was inhaling fire. Navigating this new environment required a complete overhaul of his survival skills. The catwalks were often slick with oil or missing grates, making every step a potentially fatal gamble. Uninsulated pipes radiated a dangerous heat, forcing him to move carefully through the cramped spaces. And then there were the steam vents. Without warning, a pipe would rupture, releasing a scalding cloud of high-pressure steam that could cook a man alive in seconds. He learned to listen for the telltale hiss that preceded a blast, diving for cover behind machinery just in time. The entities here were different, too. He caught glimpses of crawlers, fast-moving, insected creatures that scurried along the pipes and ceilings, and heard the unnerving, childlike giggles of smilers, entities that were said to lurk in the darkest corners, their presence marked only by their glowing eyes and teeth. His existence became a series of high-stakes calculations, a constant dance between environmental hazards and predatory creatures. The heat, the noise, the constant threat of a fatal misstep. It was a new and more visceral kind of torture, designed to break the body as surely as Level 0 had been designed to break the mind. Chapter 9. The Lure of the Pool Rooms. Weeks in the oppressive, roaring heat of the electrical station had left Lucas dehydrated and on the verge of collapse. His skin was perpetually grimy with oil and sweat, and the constant, deafening noise had given him a permanent headache. He was navigating a lower section of the level, a maintenance tunnel choked with pipes, when he felt a draft of cool, humid air. It was a stark contrast to the superheated atmosphere of the rest of the level, and it carried a faint, clean scent of chlorine. Driven by a desperate curiosity and the primal need for water, he followed the draft. It led him to a low, square opening in the concrete wall, a section of tunnel that was partially submerged in calm, clear water. It seemed to lead away from the industrial nightmare of Level 2. Hesitantly, he submerged himself in the surprisingly lukewarm water and pulled himself through the opening. The transition was immediate and surreal. The roar of machinery vanished, replaced by a gentle, soothing silence, broken only by the soft lapping of water. He emerged into a vast, sprawling complex of interconnected rooms and corridors, all constructed from pristine white and blue tiles. The architecture was clean and minimalist, reminiscent of a public swimming pool or a luxury spa, but stretched to an impossible labyrinthine scale. Sunlight, or a light that perfectly mimicked it, streamed from unseen sources in the high ceilings, glinting off the surface of the perfectly still, chest-deep water that filled every space. This was a sublevel, a pocket reality known in the whispers of the lore as the pool rooms. After the grime and danger of the previous levels, the clean, tranquil beauty of this place felt like a paradise. The water was pure and drinkable, and the air was warm and pleasant. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Lucas allowed himself to relax. He floated on his back, the water supporting his weary body, and stared up at the bright, artificial sky. The silence was a balm on his frayed nerves. He spent what might have been hours or days exploring the serene, flooded halls, wadding from one beautifully tiled room to the next. The initial sense of peace, however, slowly began to curdle into something unsettling. The perfection was too absolute. The silence was too profound. There were no signs of decay, no dust, no imperfections in the endless tiles. And there were no other living things, no insects, no algae in the water, nothing. It was a sterile, beautiful prison. The uncanny feeling grew stronger when he realized he was being watched. There was no one there, no visible entity, but the feeling was undeniable. A prickling on the back of his neck, the sense of eyes on him from just beneath the placid surface of the water. Sometimes, he would catch a fleeting ripple out of the corner of his eye in a section of the pool he had just looked away from. The serene silence began to feel menacing, the empty halls full of a hidden, waiting presence. The beautiful pools were not a sanctuary. They were a lure, a gilded cage designed to trap the unwary with a false sense of security before whatever lurked in the depths decided to reveal itself. The tranquility was a mask for a deeper, more insidious horror. Chapter 10: The Unending Journey. The illusion of paradise had shattered, leaving only a cloying, silent dread. The pristine tiles and placid water of the pool rooms now felt like the sterile walls of a psychiatric hospital. The feeling of being watched was constant, a heavy pressure against his skin. He knew he couldn't stay. To linger here was to invite a fate he couldn't begin to imagine, to be claimed by the unseen things that caused the silent ripples. His search for an exit became frantic. He swam through endless, identical tiled chambers, the perfect geometry now mocking him with its sameness. He began to explore the depths, his lungs aching as he dove down to inspect the pool floors. In one of the deeper, larger chambers, his searching hands found it, a square outline on the tiled floor, a maintenance hatch. It was made of heavy, corroded metal, a stark and ugly contrast to the surrounding perfection. A thick layer of algae on its surface suggested it had been untouched for a very long time. It took all his strength to turn the rusted, wheel-like handle. With a final, agonizing turn, it gave way. The hatch didn't just open. It was wrenched from its frame by a powerful, unseen current that immediately began to suck him in. He had no time to think, no time to take a final breath. The current pulled him from the serene, sunlit water of the pools into a dark, narrow pipe, a torrent of cold, rushing water propelling him through absolute blackness. It was a chaotic, disorienting ride. He was tumbled and thrown against the sides of the pipe, his body battered and his lungs screaming for air. Just as his vision began to fade to black, he was violently expelled, shooting out of the end of the pipe and landing with a splash in shallow water. He coughed and sputtered, gasping for air, the taste of rust and mud filling his mouth. He pushed himself up and looked around. He was in a dimly lit, flooded cave system. Water dripped from massive stalactites, and strange, bioluminescent fungi cast an eerie blue-green glow on the wet rock walls. This was yet another level, another circle of his infinite hell. He stood there, shivering and exhausted, the water lapping at his ankles. But something inside him had changed. The terror was still there, a constant companion, but it was now overlaid with a grim, hardened resignation. The archivist who fell through the floor was long gone. The desperate, panicked survivor was gone. In their place stood a wanderer, a being forged in the crucible of impossible realities. His journey was not over. In fact, he was beginning to suspect that there was no over. There was no final exit, no return to the sunlit world of old books and quiet archives. There was only the next level, the next challenge, the next fleeting moment of survival. With a deep, weary sigh, he took his first step into the glowing fungal caves. His adventures, his trials in the backrooms had only just begun. Chapter 11. The Abyssal Caves. The water that had propelled Lucas from the pool rooms was frigid, a shocking contrast to the serene warmth he had grown accustomed to. He lay shivering in the shallow, muddy water, the bioluminescent glow of the strange fungi casting long, dancing shadows on the cavern walls. This was Level 8, a place the fragmented lore referred to simply as the cave system. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, stone, and something else, a faint, acrid scent like ammonia. The oppressive silence of the pools was gone, replaced by the steady, rhythmic dripping of water from massive stalactites and the distant, unsettling scuttling of unseen things. Lucas pushed himself to his feet, his new, hardened mindset taking immediate control. Assess, adapt, survive. The fungal light was the first variable. It was dim but consistent, providing enough visibility to navigate the treacherous, uneven terrain. The water was the second. It was everywhere, forming streams and pools, but a lifetime of watching nature documentaries screamed at him that cave water could be teeming with unknown bacteria. Thirst would be a problem again. His primary threat, however, was the darkness that lay beyond the soft fungal glow. The caves were a labyrinth of tunnels and chasms, and the sounds echoing from their depths were distinctly organic. He began to move, not with the panicked urgency of his early days, but with the slow, deliberate caution of a predator himself. He stayed close to the walls, his hand trailing against the cool, damp rock, his rebar held ready. His senses, honed by constant peril, were on high alert. He noticed the fine, shimmering strands of webbing that crisscrossed some of the smaller tunnels, impossibly thick and strong. He saw the deep grooves carved into the stone floor, as if something massive and heavy had been dragged through. The entities here were not the spectral or abstract horrors of other levels. They were primal physical predators. His first close encounter came without warning. As he rounded a large rock formation, he found himself face to face with one of the level's primary inhabitants, a colossal arachnid. It was the size of a small car, its chitinous body a mottled gray that blended perfectly with the stone. It had too many eyes, all of them a milky white, and its fangs dripped with a viscous, clear venom that sizzled when it hit the ground. For a heart-stopping moment, they were both frozen. The archivist would have screamed and run. The survivor would have panicked. The wanderer simply took one slow, deliberate step backward. The creature's head tilted, its legs twitching. It wasn't aggressive, merely territorial. It was a creature of its environment, not a malevolent force. Lucas continued his slow retreat, never breaking eye contact until he had put a safe distance between them. The spider, seemingly satisfied, turned and skittered away into a dark crevice. The lesson was clear. This level was a functioning ecosystem. He was an intruder, and he had to learn its rules if he wanted to pass through. He was no longer just prey. He was an observer, a ghost moving through a world not meant for him. Chapter 12. Echoes of Civilization. Days turned into an indeterminate period of cautious navigation through the glowing fungal underworld. Lucas learned the rhythms of the cave. He learned that the giant arachnids were mostly ambush predators, easily avoided if you stayed out of their nesting tunnels. He learned to identify the acidic pools by the way they steamed and ate away at the rock, and to follow the trickles of fresh condensation on the walls for drinkable water. He was surviving, but it was a lonely, tense existence. The ever-present scuttling and the profound, echoing darkness were a constant strain on his sanity. It was the discovery of a discarded MRE wrapper that changed everything. It was half buried in the mud, its modern, military-style packaging a stark anachronism in this prehistoric environment. His heart, which had settled into a steady, grim rhythm, began to pound with a new, unfamiliar emotion: hope. Someone else was here, or had been. He followed the direction the rapper must have come from, his eyes now scanning for more than just natural threats. Soon he found other signs: a spent glow stick, a boot print that was not his own, and then, carved into a flat rock wall, a crude arrow pointing deeper into a narrow passage. Scrawled beneath it were 3 letters. MEG. He remembered the name from the deepest recesses of the online forums he had once browsed: the Major Explorer Group, a quasi-official organization of survivors dedicated to charting the backrooms, identifying threats, and establishing safe havens. It had always sounded like a fantasy, a desperate story people told themselves to combat the crushing isolation, but this was real evidence. The hope was a dangerous thing. It reminded him of Sarah, of the folly of trust, but the alternative was to remain alone in this dark, dripping labyrinth until he made a fatal mistake. He chose to follow the signs. The passage was tight, forcing him to squeeze through in some places. He could see more markings now, warnings about arachnid nests, directions toward water sources. These were not the frantic scratchings of a madman, but the systematic markings of an organized group. After what felt like an hour of tense, claustrophobic travel, the narrow passage opened into a much larger cavern. The familiar blue-green glow of the fungi was augmented by a different light: the steady, white glare of electric lanterns. In the center of the cavern, built from scavenged metal, rock, and reinforced webbing, was a small, fortified structure. A gate fashioned from rebar and sheet metal blocked the entrance. A watchtower stood beside it, and in that tower a figure holding a rifle-like object turned and pointed it directly at him. A voice, amplified by a crude bullhorn, echoed through the cavern: "Halt! Identify yourself." Civilization, or a desperate echo of it, had found him. Chapter 13. The Outpost. Lucas froze, his hands slowly rising into the air. The rebar he had carried for so long clattered to the stone floor. "I'm a survivor," he called out, his voice hoarse and cracking. "I just fell in. I'm alone." There was a tense silence from the watchtower, then a muffled conversation. The rifle remained trained on his chest. After a moment, the voice from the bullhorn spoke again. "Approach slowly. We're opening the gate." The metal gate screeched open just enough for a person to slip through. 2 figures, clad in patched-up tactical gear and armed with makeshift weapons, gestured for him to enter. Once inside, the gate was slammed shut and barred. The settlement, which he would learn was called Glopin, was a marvel of desperate ingenuity. About 15 people called this cavern home. They had rigged up a system of lanterns powered by a salvaged generator that ran on a refined, bioluminescent fungal paste. A crude hydroponic setup grew edible mosses under the glow. A large cistern collected filtered water. It was a tiny, fragile bubble of order in an ocean of chaos. He was brought before their leader, a man named Marcus. He was older, with a graying beard and the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much, but his handshake was firm. Lucas told his story: the fall, level 0, the hound, Sarah's betrayal, the harrowing journey through levels 2 and 37. Marcus and the others listened with a grim, knowing silence. These were all familiar stations on the cross for a wanderer. "You're lucky to have made it through level 8 alone," Marcus said, his voice a low gravel. "We call it the sieve. It filters out the weak and the foolish." He was offered food: a warm, tasteless but filling moss stew, and a canteen of clean almond water that seemed to wash away weeks of fatigue and paranoia. He was introduced to Alara, the outpost's medic, who checked him for injuries and gave him a salve for the cuts on his hands. He met a scout named Kaido, a quiet man who knew the cave systems better than anyone. For the first time since he had fallen, Lucas was in a community. The feeling was deeply unsettling. His instincts, sharpened by betrayal, screamed at him to remain distant, to hoard his resources, to view everyone as a potential threat. But the simple human decency he was shown began to erode that hardened shell. He watched them work together, sharing duties, protecting one another. It was a stark contrast to the zero-sum game he had been playing. He was given a small alcove to sleep in and a new set of responsibilities, helping maintain the water purifier. It was a simple, mundane task, and he clung to it like a lifeline. It was a piece of the order and purpose he had lost. He was still a wanderer, but for the first time he had found a place to rest. Chapter 14. A Fragile Peace. Lucas slowly, cautiously, integrated into the life of Glopin. He kept to himself mostly, his quiet, observant nature making him a trustworthy, if not particularly friendly member of the community. He excelled at his work on the water purifier, applying the same meticulous attention to detail he once used for archiving ancient texts. He learned the fundamental skills of this new existence. Kaido, the scout, taught him how to distinguish between the different types of bioluminescent fungi, which ones were safe to eat, which glowed brightest for lanterns, and which were mildly toxic and best used for perimeter defense. Ilara showed him how to prepare basic poultices from specific cave mosses to treat wounds and infections. He even learned from Marcus how to maintain and handle one of their crude, pressurized rebar launchers, a weapon that was more of a deterrent than a truly effective tool against the larger entities. The fragile peace and routine began to have an unexpected effect on him. The hardened, cynical wanderer who had entered the caves began to soften at the edges. He found himself engaging in quiet conversations with Ilara about the world before, discovering they had both lived in the same city. He listened to Marcus's stories of the early days of the outpost, of the friends they had lost building this small sanctuary. He felt a flicker of his former self, the man who valued knowledge and order, as he helped the group map the surrounding cave tunnels, creating a detailed chart on a large piece of salvaged sheet metal. It was a pale imitation of his old life's work, but it gave him a profound sense of purpose. However, the piece was, as the name of the outpost implied, a fragile glow in an overwhelming darkness. The generator was constantly breaking down, plunging them into near-total blackness until it could be repaired. Food was strictly rationed, and the hydroponic mosses were barely enough to sustain them. Worst of all, the entities were becoming more aggressive. The scouts reported larger and more frequent patrols of the giant arachnids near their territory. The scuttling sounds from the unmapped lower tunnels were growing louder, more numerous. A palpable tension began to grip the outpost. The weary faces grew more strained, arguments broke out over small matters, and every member of the community slept with a weapon by their side. Glopin was a sanctuary, but it was also a prison, and the walls were closing in. Lucas knew, with a cold certainty, that this semblance of a normal life was on borrowed time. Chapter 15. The Swarm. The attack came on what would have been the middle of the night. The first sign was the silence. The constant, distant scuttling that had become the background noise of their lives abruptly stopped. Kaido, on watch in the tower, noticed it first. He sounded the alarm, a loud, clanging bell that jolted everyone from their uneasy sleep. Lucas grabbed his rebar launcher and rushed to the perimeter wall, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The generator sputtered and died at that exact moment, plunging the cavern into the dim, natural glow of the fungi, and then they heard it. A sound that began as a faint chittering and grew exponentially into a deafening, wet, clicking roar. It wasn't one entity, it was hundreds, thousands. From the dark maw of a large, unexplored tunnel at the far end of the cavern, a tide of black, insectoid creatures poured forth. "Crawlers," Marcus bellowed. "To the walls, don't let them breach the gate." Lucas had only seen glimpses of them before, small, fast, dog-sized creatures that moved on 6 legs and had powerful mandibles. Individually, they were a manageable threat. As a swarm, they were a living, breathing tidal wave of teeth and claws. They crashed against the metal gate with a deafening screech, their sheer numbers causing the reinforced structure to buckle. Some began to scale the cavern walls, their sharp claws finding purchase in the rock, attempting to bypass the gate and attack from above. The battle was chaos. The air filled with the shouts of the defenders, the roar of the rebar launchers, and the high-pitched shrieks of the crawlers. Lucas stood on the rampart, firing his weapon, reloading, firing again. He wasn't aiming at individual targets. He was firing into a writhing mass, trying to slow the tide. A crawler launched itself from the wall, landing on the rampart near him. He slammed the butt of his launcher into its head, a sickening crunch echoing in the chaos, and kicked its twitching body into the fray below. Beside him, a defender was pulled from the wall, his scream cut short as the swarm consumed him. Alara had set up a triage station near the back, desperately trying to patch up the wounded as they were brought to her. The gate groaned, one of its hinges snapping under the immense pressure. They were being overrun. "Seal the inner passage." Marcus yelled, his face grim in the pale light. "We're abandoning the main cavern. Kaido, lead the retreat." They were losing. Glopant, their tiny beacon of hope and civilization, was about to be extinguished. Chapter 16. The Fall of Glopant. The retreat was a frantic, desperate scramble. Kaido led a small group of survivors, including the wounded, toward a narrow fissure in the back of the cavern, a last-ditch emergency exit they had mapped but never used. Lucas, Marcus, and a few others formed a rear guard, creating a bottleneck to buy the others precious seconds. The main gate finally collapsed with a tortured screech of metal, and the black tide of crawlers flooded into the cavern. "Go, now." Marcus roared at Lucas, firing his own weapon into the swarm. He was a force of nature, a bulwark against the chaos, but he was just one man. Lucas hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee and the newfound loyalty to the man who had shown him kindness. "That's an order, Wanderer," Marcus shouted before a massive crawler, larger than the rest, slammed into him, bearing him to the ground. Lucas saw Marcus, pinned beneath the alpha crawler, pull a pin from a grenade on his belt. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and Marcus gave him a grim, final nod. Lucas turned and ran, the sound of the explosion echoing behind him, a concussive blast that momentarily stunned the swarm and sealed the main tunnel in a rock slide. He didn't look back. He scrambled through the fissure, the shrieks of the remaining crawlers close behind. He caught up to the small group of survivors, a pathetic remnant of the community that had thrived just hours before. There were only 5 of them left, including a badly injured Alara who was being half-carried by Kaido. The emergency passage was a treacherous, natural tunnel, tight and winding. They could still hear the crawlers behind them, their claws scraping on the rock as they squeezed through the new opening Marcus's sacrifice had made. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, finally collapsing in a small, dead-end cavern far from the sounds of the attack. Glopant was gone. The fragile peace was shattered. They were refugees once again, with no supplies, no sanctuary, and a swarm of predators on their trail. Lucas looked at the small, terrified group. He saw Alara, pale and bleeding from a deep gash in her side, and his cynical, hardened shell cracked. He felt a profound sense of responsibility. He wasn't just a lone wanderer anymore. He had helped her escape. He had to keep her safe. The escape from the caves was a blur of fear and exhaustion. Kaido found a passage leading upwards, towards a strange, shimmering curtain of falling water that didn't feel wet. "An exit," he gasped. "Unstable, but it's our only chance." One by one, they plunged through the waterfall, leaving the dark, dripping horror of Level 8 behind. Chapter 17. The Endless Office. Passing through the shimmering waterfall was like being plunged into ice and then fire. Lucas came to on a scratchy, industrial-grade carpet, the smell of stale coffee and toner filling his nostrils. The deafening chaos of the crawler swarm was replaced by a low, monotonous hum that was unnervingly familiar. He was in an office, a vast, sprawling office that seemed to stretch into infinity in every direction. This was Level 4, the abandoned office. It was a cruel mockery of a normal environment. Rows of empty cubicles, beige and soul-crushing, repeated endlessly. Computers on desks hummed with a low energy, their screens displaying nothing but a blank default blue. Water coolers stood filled with almond water, a blessing that they immediately used to clean Alara's wound and rehydrate. Kaido, ever the scout, grimly confirmed their situation. "This level is safe," he said, the words sounding foreign. "Mostly. Few physical entities. The danger here is different. It's a trap of the mind." The other 2 survivors, a young couple named Ben and Chloe, were on the verge of a breakdown, overwhelmed by the loss of their home and friends. Alara was weak from her injury, running a high fever despite the almond water. The responsibility for the group fell heavily on Lucas and Kaido. For several days, the abandoned office was a sanctuary. They had a seemingly endless supply of almond water, and they found forgotten vending machines stocked with stale but edible snacks. It was a place to rest, to heal, to mourn. But Kaido's warning proved true. The level was insidious. The lack of threats made them complacent. The endless, repeating architecture was disorienting, far more psychologically draining than the clear-cut dangers of the cave. The constant hum of the computers, the flicker of the overhead fluorescent lights, it was a sterile, corporate version of the madness of Level 0. Ben and Chloe became withdrawn, often found just staring blankly at the empty computer screens. Alara's condition worsened, her fever climbing, her sleep troubled by nightmares. Lucas felt a gnawing unease. This place wasn't a refuge, it was a waiting room. It lulled you into a stupor until you simply gave up, becoming another one of the level's permanent, silent inhabitants. They had to move on, but Kaido was reluctant, fearing what lay beyond. The group was fracturing, not from betrayal, but from despair. Lucas knew that if they stayed here, they wouldn't be killed by a monster, they would simply cease to be. Chapter 18. The Window. Alara's fever broke, but it was replaced by a strange, quiet obsession. She became fascinated by the windows. The windows of Level 4 were one of its most notorious features. They were large plate-glass panes set into the walls at random intervals, but they didn't look out onto a city skyline or a peaceful courtyard. They looked out into a swirling, deep blue void, occasionally punctuated by streaks of white light. To stare into them for too long was, according to Kaido, incredibly dangerous. They show you things, he warned, his voice low. Things you want to see, a way home, lost loved ones. They promise an escape, but if you touch the glass, you're just gone. Lucas found Alara standing before one of these windows, her hand outstretched, her eyes wide and unfocused. I can see the university library, she whispered, a faint, hopeful smile on her face. The sun is coming through the main reading room window. I think I can go back. Lucas grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the glass. She struggled, her newfound strength surprising. No, let me go, it's right there, Lucas. Her voice was filled with a desperate, heartbreaking conviction. It's a lie, Alara, he said firmly, forcing her to look at him. It's the level, it's a trap. What do you see out there, really? Her eyes flickered between him and the window, her mind battling the hypnotic allure. The hopeful smile faltered. I see the light, she stammered, but the people have no faces. The illusion shattered. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing with the grief of a hope doubly lost. The incident was a wake-up call for the entire group. They saw how close they had come to losing her. Kai, shaken, finally agreed with Lucas. We have to leave, he said. Staying here is a slower death than any monster could offer. They gathered what supplies they could carry, primarily bottles of almond water. Ben and Chloe, seeing the stark reality of what the level could do, were shaken from their stupor. The journey was now not just about escaping the past, but about escaping a deceptively peaceful present. Guided by Kaido's knowledge, they began searching for a specific type of exit, a set of ornate, wooden double doors that sometimes appeared in the office walls. They were said to lead to Level 5. It was a gamble, but it was better than slowly fatting away in the endless, humming beige of the office. Chapter 19. The Terror Hotel. After a full day of walking through the monotonous office landscape, they found it. In a wall that should have been identical to all the others stood a pair of dark mahogany doors with ornate brass handles. The air around them was noticeably colder. This was the entrance to Level 5, the Terror Hotel. Pushing the doors open, they stepped from the stale, fluorescent-lit office into the grand, opulent lobby of a 1920s hotel. A massive, dust-covered chandelier hung from a vaulted ceiling. Faded velvet furniture was arranged in conversation pits on a richly patterned but threadbare carpet. The air was thick with the cloying scent of old perfume and decay. A faint, tinny jazz melody seemed to be playing from an unseen source, a ghostly tune that was both elegant and deeply unsettling. The hotel was divided into three main areas: the main hall, a grand ballroom, and the boiler room. It was eerily silent, save for the phantom music and the occasional whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves, a phenomenon the MEG had termed wallpaper chatter. Kaido explained that the primary threat here was not a single entity, but the level itself. The hotel was alive, sentient in a way, and it fed on the sanity of those who stayed too long. The architecture was known to shift, hallways leading back on themselves, rooms disappearing and reappearing. Their goal was simple, find a stable exit, but the hotel seemed to play with them. They would walk down a long, red-carpeted hallway only to find themselves back in the main lobby. The wallpaper chatter grew more distinct, whispering their names, reminding them of their fears and losses. Ben and Chloe began to argue, the hotel's influence exacerbating their stress and grief. Alara, still weak, grew more and more disoriented. Lucas felt a strange pressure in his mind, a seductive whisper telling him to find a room to lie down to rest forever. He fought it, his hardened will the only thing keeping him focused. He realized the hotel was trying to separate them, to isolate them and pick them off one by one. He had to keep the group together. They found refuge in the cavernous, empty ballroom, the phantom music louder here. In the center of the floor, Lucas noticed something strange. A collection of dark, crimson stains on the floorboards, almost like something had been dragged towards a set of service doors at the far end of the room. On the wall next to the doors, scrawled in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "It lives in the boiler room. Don't listen to the walls." The whispers intensified, telling him to leave his friends to save himself. But looking at Alara's pale, frightened face, he knew he couldn't. The hotel was a predator, and to escape it, they would have to venture into its heart. Chapter 20. The Boiler Room and the Beast. Alara collapsed. Her breathing was shallow, her skin clammy. The hotel's oppressive psychological aura was proving too much for her weakened state. "She's going into shock," she muttered, her medical training surfacing through a haze of fear. "We need more almond water, a clean place to rest, none of which we'll find here." Kaido pointed a shaking finger at the service doors. "The MEG logs say the same thing. The hotel is controlled by an entity they call the Beast of Level 5. It's supposed to be in the boiler room. The logs are conflicting. Some say it's unkillable. Others say it can be reasoned with. But they all agree on one thing. The safest exits appear only after you've confronted it." It was a suicide mission. But looking at Alara, Lucas knew there was no other choice. Leaving Ben to watch over Chloe and Alara, Lucas and a reluctant Kaido pushed open the service doors and descended a flight of rickety iron stairs into the hotel's sweltering underbelly. The boiler room was a claustrophobic nightmare of pipes, steam, and hissing machinery. The heat was immense, even worse than level 2. In the center of the room was a massive, ancient boiler, its iron plating covered in strange, pulsating organic growths. The phantom jazz music was gone, replaced by a low, rhythmic heartbeat-like thumping that seemed to emanate from the boiler itself. As they approached, a shape began to coalesce from the steam and shadows near the boiler. It was not a creature of flesh and bone. It was a being of shifting forms, sometimes appearing as a vaguely humanoid figure made of writhing wallpaper patterns, other times as a tangle of pipes and wires with a single, glowing red eye. The Beast of Level 5. The whispers were no longer in the walls, they were directly in their minds, deafening and intimate. "Leave this place," it hissed, its voice a collage of every fear Lucas had ever felt. "She is already lost. Save yourself. You are a wanderer, you are meant to be alone." Kaido froze, paralyzed by fear, but Lucas stood his ground. He remembered the hound, the swarm, the betrayal. He had been a victim for too long, he was no longer just enduring, he was fighting back. "We need a way out," Lucas said, his voice steady, projecting a confidence he did not feel. "And we need almond water for our friend." The beast swirled and reformed, its red eye fixing on him. "Everything in the backrooms has a price," the voice echoed in his skull. "You wish for passage. You wish for sustenance. What will you offer me in return? What does a lone wanderer have that a god of this place could possibly want?" Lucas looked at the monstrous, reality-bending entity. He had no weapon that could harm it, no great power. All he had was his mind, his experiences, and a choice to make. The unending journey had led him to this, a negotiation with a nightmare for the soul of his friend. And so he stands before the beast, a man who has survived on instinct, strength, and sheer luck, now finds himself in a situation where none of that matters. His weapon is useless, his friends are dying, and the only way forward is to strike a bargain with the nightmare that rules the level. What an incredible arc. We just witnessed Lucas and the MEG build a home, only to see it catastrophically destroyed. We saw them escape the physical threat of the crawler swarm, only to face the insidious psychological warfare of the office and the hotel. It's a classic sci-fi trope executed perfectly. The realization that the most dangerous prisons are not the ones with monsters, but the ones that promise peace, the ones that prey on your mind. The fall of Glopant was a turning point. It forged Lucas into something new, not just a survivor looking out for himself, but a leader responsible for the last remnants of his community. And now, that responsibility has led him here, to a negotiation with a being of pure thought and terror. Which brings me to the question I want to leave you with. What can a man who has lost everything possibly offer a god? When your only possessions are your trauma and your will to live, what is the price of passage? Let me know your theories, what the bargain will be, and what it will cost him, down in the comments. I'm genuinely fascinated to see what you all come up with. If you enjoyed this descent into the deeper levels of the Backrooms and want to see how Lucas's story continues, please hit that like button. And if you're new here, consider subscribing to Luke's Sci-Fi Tailies for more deep dives into narrative universes like this one. Until next time, keep exploring the static, and be wary of any place that feels too safe. Chapter 21, The Bargain of Scars. The boiler room was a sweltering, metallic lung. The rhythmic thumping of the boiler was a monstrous heartbeat, and the beast of level 5 swirled before them, a nauseating collage of peeling floral wallpaper and rusted pipes. Its voice was not a sound but a pressure inside their skulls, a symphony of their own worst fears. Kaito was frozen, his face a mask of primal terror, but Lucas's fear had been tempered into a sharp, cold instrument. He looked at the beast, then glanced back at the stairs where Alara lay dying. What does a lone wanderer have that a god of this place could possibly want? The voice echoed, laced with a mocking curiosity. It wants a story, Lucas whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. The archivist in him understood. This creature, trapped in its own timeless domain, was a collector. It didn't want objects. It fed on potent, raw human experience. "What are you doing?" Kaito hissed, his voice a dry rasp. "Don't talk to it." Ignoring him, Lucas spoke louder, his voice steady. "I have something for you." "Not a thing, a memory, my most valuable one." The beast stilled, its single red eye focusing on him with intense interest. "You want to know what a wanderer has? I have loss, I have terror, I have seen a sanctuary burn. I will give you the fall of Glopant. You can have the battle, the screams, the sacrifice of our leader, Marcus. You can feel the heat of the explosion that saved us, all of it. In exchange, you will give us what we need to save her, and you will show us a way out of this level." Now, the beast seemed to lean in, the psychic pressure intensifying. "A memory, fresh and raw, a potent offering, it is. Acceptable." Kaito let out a choked gasp as the deal was struck. There was no handshake, no contract, just a sudden, violent psychic intrusion. Lucas's vision went white. He was standing on the ramparts of Glopant again, the shrieks of the crawlers deafening. He felt the weight of the rebar launcher, the grit of the dust in his teeth. But he was a passenger in his own body. He watched himself fight. He felt the terror. He saw Marcus go down, the grim nod, the blinding flash of the grenade. He experienced it all with a horrifying clinical detachment as the raw emotion, the grief, the loyalty, the adrenaline was siphoned away from him. When his vision cleared, he was on his knees, panting, an inexplicable coldness hollowing out his chest. The beast pulsed with a soft, contented light. In the ballroom above, a heavy thud echoed. A metal crate had materialized. And on the far wall of the boiler room, a door he had never seen before, marked with a faded red exit sign, began to glow faintly. The bargain was complete. Chapter 22, Level 6, Lights Out. Lucas, are you okay?" Kaido's voice was frantic as he helped Lucas to his feet. "I'm fine," Lucas said, but the words felt strange, distant. The memory of Glopant was still there, a perfect, detailed file in his mind, but the emotional charge was gone. It was like reading a particularly grim historical document. He felt nothing. "Get the crate. Let's get Alara and get out of here." They retrieved the supplies, a treasure trove of medical kits and bottles of pure almond water, and administered some to Alara, who was barely conscious. Ben and Chloe huddled nearby, their faces etched with fear and confusion. Lucas led them to the glowing exit door. "Whatever is on the other side," he said, his voice a flat monotone, "we face it together. Stay close." He pushed the door open and was met not with a sight or a sound, but with the utter absence of both. Stepping through was like being submerged in ink. Absolute darkness swallowed the light from the boiler room, and a profound, bone-deep silence crushed all noise. The door clicked shut behind them, its sound instantly devoured by the void. They had arrived in level 6, lights out. The shock was immediate and total. Lucas reached out, his hand finding Kaido's shoulder. He couldn't hear his own breathing, his own heartbeat. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to rise but found no emotional purchase in his hollowed-out mind. Kaido grabbed his hand and began tracing letters on his palm. PHANTOMSHALUCINATIONSDONTLETGO. It was a world of pure sensory deprivation, a place designed to make you doubt your own existence. Ben stumbled, his silent fall felt only by Chloe, who clung to him. The only reality was the touch of another human being. Lucas felt a faint vibration through the floor and immediately pulled the group to a halt. In this suffocating silence, even the smallest stimulus was a potential threat, and his newly detached mind was processing every detail with an unnerving, machine-like focus. Chapter 23: The Anchor in the Dark. Days melted into a single, unending night. Time was measured in the slow shuffle of feet on the cold metal floor and the gnawing anxiety that festered in the silence. The group's cohesion began to break down under the immense psychological strain. Chloe's silent, racking sobs were a constant vibration passed down the line, a tremor of pure despair. Ben, her anchor, grew increasingly agitated. During one halt, he yanked on the tether connecting him to Lucas. He grabbed Lucas's hand, his fingers tracing frantically. "YOURFAULTWHEREAREW." Lucas felt the accusation but didn't feel the sting. The bargain had taken more than a memory, it had taken a part of his humanity. This emotional void, however, became their greatest asset. While the others were lost in a sea of terror, Lucas's mind was a fortress of cold logic. He was the anchor. He squeezed Ben's hand firmly, a simple, solid pressure that was meant to convey reassurance, and traced back. KEPMOVINGSTAYLEFT. He had devised a simple, foolproof plan. He tore his own shirt into long strips, creating a crude rope that tethered them all together about 5 feet apart. He took the lead, with a still weak Alara directly behind him, then Kaido, Chloe, and Ben at the rear. His left hand never left the cold, smooth surface of the wall. It was a classic maze-solving technique from a life he barely remembered. As long as they followed one wall, they could not get lost in circles. It was a small piece of order in a universe of absolute chaos. His focus was total. He ignored the phantom touches on his shoulder, the fleeting whispers his mind invented to fill the silence. He was no longer a man feeling his way through the dark. He was a machine executing a program. Survive. Protect the group. Follow the wall. Chapter 24: The Sunken City. The transition was gradual. The smooth metal floor became uneven, then slick with a thin film of cool water. A new smell cut through the sterile air, the unmistakable scent of salt and rain-soaked stone. The oppressive silence finally broke, replaced by the gentle, rhythmic lapping of water. After what felt like an eternity of blindness, a faint, gray light began to bleed into the world. They emerged from the metallic corridor and stopped, stunned. They were standing on the rooftop of a skyscraper, but there was no city below. Only water. An endless, black, placid ocean stretched to a horizon where a bruised, twilight sky met the sea. All around them, the tops of other buildings, Art Deco spires, brutalist concrete blocks, jutted from the water like the gravestones of a dead metropolis. This was level 7. The sunken city, Kaido mouthed, his voice a hoarse croak after days of disuse. The main danger is in the water, one big one, they call it the Leviathan. Their path forward was a treacherous, three-dimensional maze. They leaped across rooftops, balanced on rusted girders that served as makeshift bridges, and climbed down crumbling fire escapes to swim through channels of frigid dark water to the next building. Alara, though recovering, was still weak, and Lucas and Ben had to help her across the gaps. During one of the swims, Chloe screamed, pointing a shaking finger into the depths. Far below, a shape, impossibly large and darker than the water around it, had passed silently beneath them. It was gone in an instant, but the primal fear it instilled lingered, a cold dread that clung to them longer than the water. This level wasn't about psychological games. It was about a simple, terrifying truth. They were small and helpless, and something ancient and enormous was hunting in the depths below. Chapter 25, A Fleeting Alliance. For days they survived by scavenging. They found sealed offices in the upper floors of the skyscrapers, untouched by the water, containing forgotten supplies, stale protein bars, bottled water, and once, miraculously, a working solar-powered radio that only produced static. It was in one of these high-rise islands that they found signs of others. A recently expired glow stick, a fresh MRE wrapper. "Hello," Lucas called out, his voice echoing in the vast, empty office lobby. From behind a row of overturned desks, 3 figures rose, armed with sharpened pipes. They were led by a woman with short, practical hair and hard, calculating eyes. "Drop your weapons," she ordered, her voice devoid of warmth. "Who are you?" This was Lena. Her small group had been navigating the sunken city for months, becoming experts in its deadly currents and hidden dangers. After a tense standoff, an alliance was forged. Lena's group had knowledge. Lucas's group had a trained medic in Alara. The trade was mutually beneficial. "We stick together, we share resources, we watch each other's backs," Lucas stated, offering a hand. Lena looked at it, then at him, and gave a firm, brief shake. The alliance, however, was fraught with tension. Lena's methods were ruthless. She viewed Ben and Chloe's occasional emotional breakdowns as a critical liability. "Fear makes you noisy. Noisy gets you killed," she said to Lucas one evening as they watched the twilight sky from a rooftop perch. "You're soft on them. Your sentiment will get us all dragged to the bottom." "They're survivors, not soldiers," Lucas countered, his voice low and firm. "We lost our home. They're allowed to grieve. We protect our own, all of them. That's the only rule that matters." The line had been drawn. Lucas's sense of responsibility, born from Marcus's sacrifice, was in direct conflict with Lena's cold, pragmatic survivalism. Chapter 26, The Lighthouse. "There," Kaido said, pointing a steady hand toward the horizon. For the first time, a new feature had appeared in the endless cityscape of water and rooftops. A lighthouse, its powerful beam cutting a slow, lonely arc through the perpetual twilight. An exit. The MEG logs call it the Fer de El Aubli, the lighthouse of the forgot. It's stable. But the swim, it's the longest open water stretch on the level. Lena stared at it, her hard expression unreadable. "We've seen it before. Never had the materials to make a raft that would hold. Never had the numbers to risk it." Now they did. They spent 2 days stripping materials from an abandoned maintenance floor, large plastic panels, buoyant foam insulation, and meters of thick electrical cabling to use as rope. The construction of the raft was a tense affair, a fragile collaboration between the two groups. Finally, it was ready. They lowered the crude vessel into the dark water and set off, paddling with scavenged pieces of sheet metal. The journey was an exercise in silent, collective terror. The water was unnaturally still, the only sound the dipping of their paddles. Every shadow in the depths, every ripple on the surface sent a fresh wave of fear through the group. Halfway there, it happened. The water directly ahead of them began to bulge upwards. The Leviathan was surfacing, but it wasn't an attack. A colossal, barnacle-encrusted spine, wider than a bus, broke the surface, glided past them for 100 yards and then submerged again, creating a powerful wave that almost capsized their raft. They clung to the ropes, hearts pounding, until the water was still again. They had been inspected and ignored. When they finally reached the stone base of the lighthouse, they scrambled onto the rocks, leaving the raft to drift away, a silent offering to the sea. The heavy iron door creaked open, revealing a spiral staircase that ascended into darkness. Chapter 27: The Uncanny Valley. The climb was disorienting, a seemingly endless ascent in the dark. The air grew progressively warmer, the damp, salty smell replaced by the scent of cut grass and dry pavement. The staircase ended abruptly at a simple, 6-panel wooden door, utterly incongruous with the stone tower around it. Lucas pushed it open and squinted, blinded not by brightness, but by sheer normalcy. They stepped out onto a perfect asphalt sidewalk. Before them lay a sprawling suburban neighborhood, bathed in the soft, silver light of a full moon that hung motionless in a starless sky. Identical 2-story houses with manicured lawns and pristine white picket fences repeated endlessly in every direction. Streetlights cast a warm, inviting glow. There was no wind. There were no crickets. The silence was absolute. "Level 9, Kaido whispered, a new kind of fear in his voice. "The danger here is a rule, a single, simple rule." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "We stay on the asphalt, the street, the sidewalk, that's it. You do not touch the lawns, you do not approach the houses, the things in the windows, the neighbors, they watch. They are completely passive as long as you don't trespass. If you step on the grass—" He trailed off, swallowing hard. "What happened?" Chloe asked, her voice a small tremor in the silence. "You just stop being," Kaido replied grimly. "You're just gone." The group stood frozen, huddled on the small patch of sidewalk by the door which had now vanished. They were in a picture-perfect postcard of a nightmare. It was a world that looked safe, that looked like home, but every blade of grass was a landmine, and every dark window held a silent, waiting executioner. Chapter 28: A Trespass and a Parting. Walking the empty street was a unique form of psychological torture. They kept to the exact center of the road, a tight, nervous cluster. Out of the corner of his eye, Lucas could see them, fleeting, humanoid silhouettes in the darkened windows of the houses they passed, their forms indistinct, their attention fixed entirely on the group. The desire to look directly at them was almost overwhelming, but Kaido had warned against that too. After hours of walking, the endless repetition began to grate on them. Lena, ever the pragmatist, was losing her patience. She pointed to a cluster of blinking radio towers on a distant hill, a clear landmark in the otherwise uniform landscape. "That has to be an exit, but the road winds for miles. There's a park between here and there. We can cut across, be there in 20 minutes. "No," Lucas said immediately, stopping the group. "Kaido told us the rule, no grass, no exceptions." "That's a stupid rule," Lena shot back, her voice dangerously loud in the silence. "It's a field, not a minefield. Your caution is going to get us killed from exhaustion. We're going." "Lena, don't," Alara pleaded. "It's not worth the risk." But Lena's mind was made up. She looked at her 2 followers. "We're leaving. If you want to spend the rest of your short lives walking in circles, be my guest." Lucas stood in her way. "Don't do this, Lena." Their eyes met in a final, silent battle of wills. Lena shoved him aside. "Survival isn't about following rules. It's about knowing when to break them." She and her 2 companions stepped off the curb and onto the perfect, dew-kissed grass of the community park. For a horrifying second, nothing happened. Lena shot Lucas a triumphant, mocking smirk. Then, in perfect, silent unison, a light flicked on in the upstairs window of every single house surrounding the park. Hundreds of them. The silhouettes of the neighbors were now starkly visible, all looking down at the trio. Lena's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sudden, profound understanding. There was no scream, no flash. They simply weren't there anymore. The lights in the houses clicked off. The silence returned. Chapter 29. The House on the Hill. The group stood paralyzed on the asphalt. The image of the vanished survivors burned into their minds. Ben retched into a storm drain, and Chloe sobbed into his shoulder. The grim reality of the level had been demonstrated with brutal efficiency. Lucas, though horrified, felt a cold affirmation of his choice. His leadership, his caution, had kept his people alive. He rallied the shattered survivors. "We keep moving," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "We stick to the road, we don't stop." They walked for what felt like a day, the motionless moon a constant, silent observer. The perfect, repeating houses became a form of visual torture, a suburban hell of infinite conformity. Just as despair began to set in again, they saw it. At the end of a long, straight road, perched on a small hill that broke the flat monotony of the landscape, was a single house that was different. It was an old Victorian with a gabled roof and a wide, wraparound porch. And unlike the other houses, a single upstairs window glowed with a warm, welcoming, golden light. "An exit," Alara whispered, hope and fear warring in her voice. "Or a trap," Kaido murmured. "But it's the first different thing we've seen since we arrived. It has to be our goal." The final walk up that hill was the most terrifying ordeal yet. It felt like a final exam. They were in the open, on a direct path, and they could feel the collective gaze of the entire neighborhood pressing in on them. Every dark window was a silent judge. Lucas kept his eyes fixed on the warm light of the Victorian house, a lone beacon in the uncanny darkness. He could feel the presence of the neighbors, a palpable weight in the air, but they remained observers. They had followed the rules. Chapter 30. The Fields of Gold. They reached the foot of the house's driveway. The property line was marked by a small, crumbling stone wall. Stepping over it felt like crossing a finish line. The oppressive feeling of being watched vanished instantly. They were safe. The front door of the old house was unlocked, its brass knob cool to the touch. Lucas pushed it open slowly. The interior was not what they expected. It wasn't dusty or abandoned. It was furnished and cozy, like a normal, lived-in home. But that wasn't the most jarring part. All the windows, instead of looking out onto the dark, moonlit suburb, revealed a completely different world. Through the panes of glass, they could see vast, rolling fields of golden wheat swaying gently in a warm breeze under a brilliant, cloudless blue sky. "Level 10, Kaido breathed, a tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "The fields of wheat, it's safe. The logs say it's truly safe." The sheer sensory shock of it, the sight of a blue sky, the feeling of a warm, natural breeze wafting through the open door, the smell of sun-baked earth was overwhelming. Chloe sank to her knees on the welcome mat, weeping with relief. Ben knelt beside her, his own shoulders shaking. Alara leaned against the doorframe, a genuine, radiant smile spreading across her exhausted face. Lucas stepped out onto the porch, leaving the others in the doorway. He looked back at the silent, dark suburban street, then turned to face the endless, sun-drenched fields. They had survived. They had paid a terrible price in blood, in sanity, and for him in memory. But they had made it. He was no longer just the archivist who fell, or the wanderer who ran. He was a leader who had guided the last remnants of his found family to a sanctuary. It was not the end of the journey, he knew. But for the first time in an eternity, it was a place to rest. Chapter 31. The Golden Stagnation. The first week in Level 10 was a baptism of peace. The trauma of their journey seemed to wash away under the brilliant, unmoving sun. They found a small cluster of farmhouses, identical but clean, and claimed one as their own. The silence, once a source of terror in Lights Out or the pool rooms, was now a gentle, soothing balm, broken only by the constant, whisper-soft rustle of the wheat. Ilara, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, allowed her shoulders to relax. She spent her days tending to a small patch of earth by their porch, coaxing the strange, native mosses she'd carried from the caves to grow in neat, orderly lines. It was a piece of Glopen, a piece of Marcus, she was determined to keep alive. Kaido, ever the cartographer, had set about the impossible task of mapping the level, though every expedition ended with the same conclusion. The fields were infinite, and the farmhouses repeated on a grid. Ben and Chloe, who had been hollowed out by fear, rediscovered a simple, quiet intimacy. They would walk the fields for hours, hand in hand, their laughter a sound so alien and precious it made the others stop and listen. Everyone was healing, everyone except Lucas. He sat on the porch steps watching them. His mind, the cold, analytical engine that had guided them through the darkness, was still running, still processing. He observed Chloe playfully push Ben, who stumbled back with a grin. Analysis, a gesture of affection, a display of comfort and trust. He watched Alara hum a tuneless melody as she worked. Analysis, an expression of contentment, a subconscious release of tension. He understood it all on a clinical level, the way he understood the mechanics of the water purifier in Glopant. But the feeling, the warmth that should have accompanied these observations, was absent. It was like watching a film in a language he could not speak, with no subtitles. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Alara's voice broke his concentration. She had come to sit beside him, wiping the dirt from her hands onto her worn trousers. The sky. I'd forgotten what a blue sky looked like without the fear of something falling from it. "It is a stable environment," Lucas replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The light source is constant, providing optimal conditions for the primary food source to grow. There are no observable atmospheric anomalies. It is statistically a near-perfect sanctuary." Alara's small smile faltered. She had grown accustomed to his detached tone during their flight, but here, in the calm, it was jarring. It was the voice of a machine. "That's not what I meant, Lucas. I mean, don't you feel it, the peace? We're safe. You got us here. You can rest now." He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "Rest is a state of temporary inactivity. I'm not inactive. I am observing." He paused, processing. "The memory of Marcus's sacrifice, the battle for Glopant, it is a clear file in my mind. I can access the data, the sequence of events, but the associated emotional response is null. The beast took the trauma, but it seems to have taken the capacity for its opposite as well. Joy, relief. These are inaccessible concepts." A chill went through Alara that had nothing to do with the warm breeze. She was looking at the man who had pulled her away from the hypnotic window in the office, the man who had faced a god in a boiler room to save her life, and she realized he was a stranger. The bargain had saved her body, but it had fundamentally broken the man who made it. "But you're still you," she said, her voice softer, a plea for reassurance. "You're still Lucas." "My name is Lucas," he stated, as if confirming a fact from a database. "My core programming, my memories before the fall, remain intact. However, the operational parameters have been significantly altered. The archivist is a historical file. The Wanderer is the current operating system." He looked back out at the fields, at the others. "My function was to get them to safety. That function is complete. New directives are required." He felt no satisfaction in their survival, only the quiet, logical hum of a completed task, and the vast, empty silence of waiting for the next one. The golden paradise felt like a waiting room, and the peace everyone else cherished was, to him, a maddening stagnation. Chapter 32. The Rot in the Wheat. The subtle decay of their sanctuary began not with a bang, but with a whisper of forgotten words. Kaido sat at the wooden table in the main farmhouse, a large piece of scavenged cardboard in front of him, painstakingly trying to reconstruct his map of Level 8 from memory. It was an exercise he did daily, an attempt to honor the dead of Glopant by preserving their knowledge. Lucas watched from a corner, observing. "The main cavern was here," Kaido muttered, sketching a large circle. "Marcus fell, he fell near the east gate." "It was the west gate," Alara corrected gently from across the room, where she was grinding wheat into flour. "It collapsed the tunnel leading to the arachnid nests. That's what gave us the time to get to the fissure." Kaido looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. "No, I'm sure it was the east. I remember the glow of the toxic fungi was on our left." He stared at his drawing, a flicker of profound uncertainty in his eyes. He shook his head, frustrated. It's fuzzy. It's all getting fuzzy. He angrily scribbled out the drawing, crumpling the cardboard in his hands. It was the first time Lucas had ever seen Kaito's formidable memory fail him. The next symptom was apathy. Ben and Chloe, once a source of life and laughter, grew quieter. Their walks in the fields became longer, their conversations shorter. One afternoon, Lucas found them sitting back to back in the tall wheat, their eyes open but unfocused, a placid, unnerving emptiness on their faces. "Ben," Lucas said, his voice cutting through the stillness, "we need to reinforce the southern wall of the farmhouse. The foundation is loose." Ben turned his head slowly, his movements sluggish. "Why?" he asked, his voice a soft monotone. "The walls hold, we're safe here, there's no need." "It is about maintaining the structure," Lucas insisted. "Proactive measures prevent future failure." "There is no future here," Chloe added, her voice just as placid. "There's just now, and now is peaceful." She turned her gaze back to the endless golden stalks, and the conversation was over. That night, Lucas brought his findings to Alara and Kaito. They sat around the table, a single candle casting long, dancing shadows on their worried faces. "It's the level," Lucas stated, his tone flat and clinical. "It's a passive but hostile environment. It doesn't attack the body, it attacks the mind. Kaito's memories are degrading. Ben and Chloe are losing their will, their personalities. The wheat sustains us physically, but it's slowly consuming our minds, replacing them with a state of serene emptiness." Alara wrapped her arms around herself, her earlier sense of peace now curdling into dread. "Apathy sickness. I read about it in an old MEG log. They described a level that offered perfect safety and sustenance, but those who stayed too long, they just stopped. They forgot how to eat, how to sleep. They just faded." "We've traded a prison of monsters for a prison of comfort," Kaito whispered, his face pale. The fear in his eyes was a familiar, terrible thing, but it was also a sign that he wasn't lost yet. It was a spark. "We're dying, just slowly. What do we do, Lucas?" They both looked at him. In the crises of the past, he had always had the answer, his cold logic a beacon in the chaos. He looked at their terrified faces, then at the doorway, which framed the endlessly rustling, deceptively beautiful wheat. His programming was clear. Stagnation was a threat. The variable had changed, but the primary directive remained the same. "We survive," Lucas said. "And to survive, we must move. We must find an exit. We have to leave paradise." Chapter 33, The Sound of Metal. The decision to leave was one thing, the execution was another. How do you search for a door in a room of infinite size? For 3 days, Lucas undertook the search alone. He refused to let the others come, fearing the wheat's soporific effect would be too strong on them over long distances. He would set out at what they designated as dawn, a piece of scavenged rebar in hand, and walk in a perfectly straight line, his internal compass unerring. The landscape was a hypnotic, maddening loop. Golden wheat, blue sky, a gentle breeze that always seemed to come from his left. An occasional identical farmhouse would drift into view, a silent, useless landmark in the endless ocean of gold. He felt no fatigue, no despair. He was a machine performing a function: walk, observe, record, repeat. He was searching for an anomaly, a single note out of key in a perfect, monotonous symphony. He found it on the 4th day, miles from their temporary home. At first, it was a dark line on the horizon, too sharp and regular to be another farmhouse. As he drew closer, its form became clear. It was a grain silo, a colossal cylinder of corrugated, rusting steel that speared the perfect blue sky. It was an obscenity in this pristine world. The rust was a deep, angry orange, a color of decay and reality that did not belong. The metal creaked and groaned in the wind, a sound of industry and friction in the otherwise silent landscape. It was an error in the system, a piece of a different level that had punched through. It was their way out. He stood at its base, looking up. It was at least 200 feet high, a monument to a world that worked and sweated and built things, A world that was everything level 10 was not. He placed a hand on the cool metal, the texture rough and real under his palm. He felt a faint, low-frequency vibration from within. It was alive. His return journey was made with a new purpose. When he walked back into their farmhouse, the others knew immediately. His posture was the same, his expression unchanged, but the intensity of his focus was a palpable force. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I have found it," he announced, unrolling a piece of cardboard on which he'd sketched the silo's location relative to their farmhouse. A structure, industrial, non-conforming to the level's established architecture. It is the exit. He then turned to Ben and Chloe, who were sitting listlessly by the window. "You will pack 2 days' worth of water and ground wheat. You will prepare to move. That is an order." His voice, stripped of all emotion, was not cruel, but it was absolute. It was the voice of pure command, and it shocked them out of their lethargy. Ben flinched, then slowly nodded, a flicker of his old self returning to his eyes. Fear was a powerful antidote to apathy. "An order?" Alara questioned, stepping forward. "Lucas, they're not soldiers." "In this environment, compliance is a prerequisite for survival," Lucas countered, his gaze unwavering. "Their apathy is a liability. Fear and purpose will counteract it. We will all travel to the silo. We will enter it and we will find the way to the next level. The discussion is over." The journey was a silent, tense affair. The rustling of the wheat no longer sounded like a peaceful whisper. It was the hiss of a snake, a lullaby of oblivion they were now desperate to escape. They walked in a tight formation, Lucas in the lead, his eyes fixed on the distant metal tooth on the horizon. The golden fields were no longer a sanctuary. They were the enemy, a beautiful, smiling monster that had tried to devour their souls, and they were running for their lives. Chapter 34, The Ghost of Level 1. The heavy silo door screeched in protest as Lucas and Kaido put their shoulders to it, heaving it open just enough to slip through. The air that hit them was a physical shock. The warm, sun-baked scent of the fields vanished, replaced by the cool, metallic tang of ozone and the faint smell of lubricating oil. They had stepped out of the dream and back into the machine. Inside, the space was a cavern of metal and shadow. A single string of bare electric bulbs, wired to a softly humming generator, cast a weak, yellow light down a spiral staircase that descended into darkness. The sound of their footsteps echoed unnervingly in the sudden silence. "This feels more like it," Kaido murmured, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. "I don't think I'll ever trust a blue sky again." They descended cautiously, the rest of the group following close behind. The staircase wrapped around the silo's inner wall, and as they went deeper they saw it. A small, organized camp had been set up on a metal platform halfway down. 4 simple cots were arranged neatly. A water purifier, a more advanced model than the one they'd had at Glopin, gurgled quietly. Spread across a large metal workbench were maps, schematics of machinery, and detailed notes on the psychological effects of Level 10. This wasn't the camp of desperate survivors. It was the outpost of a methodical, long-term operation. "We're not the first," Alara whispered, her eyes wide. They knew what this place does." "Took you long enough," a voice said. The voice was low, rough, and laced with an unmistakable, cynical amusement. It came from the deepest shadows beneath the platform. A figure detached itself from the darkness, stepping into the weak lamplight. It was a woman dressed in practical, patched-up gear, a makeshift pulse rifle held loosely in her grip, its power cell glowing a faint, menacing blue. She was lean, all sharp angles and tense muscle, and a long, wicked-looking scar, white and puckered, cut a path from her right temple down to her jawline, pulling one corner of her mouth into a permanent, slight sneer. Ben and Chloe gasped. Kaido instinctively moved to shield them, raising his own rebar launcher. Alara froze, her mind racing. She had heard the story of Lucas's first and only other traveling companion, of the desperate fight over a bottle of almond water. She looked at the woman, then at Lucas, expecting an explosion. But Lucas didn't move. His expression remained one of neutral observation. He felt no jolt of recognition, no surge of anger, no icy dread of betrayal. His mind simply accessed a file. Name, Sarah. Encountered, level 1. Status, hostile. Outcome, conflict over resources resulting in separation. The data was there, but the pain, the bitterness, the fear, it was all gone. Sarah saw his placid reaction, and her sneer deepened into a genuine, humorless smirk. "Well, look at you," she said, her eyes, harder and colder than he remembered, raking over his group before settling back on him. "The archivist who ran. I wondered what happened to you. Looks like the Backrooms finally put some steel in your spine. Or maybe," she took another step forward, her gaze intensifying, "it just took something out." Her words hung in the air, a perfect, brutal diagnosis of the man he had become. The ghost of his first failure had returned, not as a monster to be fought, but as a mirror reflecting the empty space where his humanity used to be. Chapter 35. A Different Kind of Survivor. A tense silence filled the silo, thick and heavy with unspoken history. Kaido kept his rebar launcher aimed at Sarah's chest, his knuckles white. Alara had her hand on a medical knife at her belt, her eyes darting between Sarah and Lucas, waiting for the signal that would define this encounter. Sarah ignored them, her focus entirely on Lucas. "You can tell your guard dog to stand down," she said, her voice dripping with condescending calm. "If I wanted you dead, you'd have been dead before you reached the bottom step." From the shadows behind her, 3 more figures emerged. They were equipped like she was, their faces grim and their movements economical. They were not a desperate rabble, they were a unit. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head, raised his own weapon towards Kaido, an unspoken challenge. "Stand down, Kaido," Lucas said, his voice cutting through the tension. It was a simple command devoid of emotion, but it carried an absolute authority. Kaido hesitated, then slowly, reluctantly, lowered his weapon. "Good boy," Sarah murmured, before turning her attention to the entire group. "My name is Sarah, this is my crew, and this is our outpost. You're trespassing." "We're looking for an exit," Alara said, finding her voice. "That's all, we don't want any trouble." "Everybody wants an exit," Sarah shot back. "Trouble is just what happens along the way. We've been here for 7 months. We've seen what this place does to people. We call it the Golden Fade. You lot look like you were about 2 weeks from forgetting your own names." Her eyes scanned them, Ben and Chloe's lingering vacancy, Kaido's unease, Alara's defiance, and Lucas's unnerving stillness. "So, the question is, what do you have to offer?" "We have a medic," Lucas stated simply. "A good one, and a scout with knowledge of MEG logs." Sarah's eyes flickered to Alara, a flicker of genuine interest in her expression. Medics were a rare and valuable commodity. "And what about you, archivist? What are you now, the stoic leader, the silent muscle?" "He's the reason we're still alive," Alara said defensively. "I'm sure he is," Sarah replied, a strange, bitter understanding in her voice. She walked a slow circle around Lucas, studying him like a fascinating but dangerous specimen. "I survived level 1, she began, her voice dropping lower. "I made it through the boiler rooms of level 2 and the endless, crawling darkness of level 8. Every step of the way, I had to fight to claw to make choices that left scars." She lightly touched the one on her face. "I did what I had to do to survive that day we met. You ran, I fought. We both ended up here, but I remember every second of it. I remember being hungry enough to kill for a sip of water. I remember being terrified. That fear is what keeps me sharp." "What keeps you sharp, Lucas? What's left inside you?" "My objective is the survival of this unit," Lucas said. "The methodology is irrelevant." "Methodology is everything," she countered. She stopped in front of him so close he could smell the ozone from her rifle. "There is an exit at the very bottom of this silo, a multi-lock temporal gate. It requires a minimum of 7 people to operate simultaneously. My crew has 4, you have 5. You see the convenient math of the situation." She held his gaze. "We're going to work together, not because we trust each other, but because we are both useful tools to one another. And when this is over, we will go our separate ways. Are those terms acceptable? She was offering a partnership born of pure, cynical pragmatism. It was a language Lucas, in his current state, understood perfectly. Acceptable, he confirmed. The deal was struck, not with a handshake but with a shared, cold acknowledgement of mutual desperation. Chapter 36, The Echoing Archives. The Alliance was a Cold War fought in close quarters. Sarah's crew, a silent, hulking man named Jax, a wiry tech specialist called Anya, and a nervous but sharp-eyed scout named Reese, viewed Lucas's group as a package of liabilities. Alara and Kaido, in turn, watched Sarah's every move, convinced a betrayal was not a question of if, but when. Lucas and Sarah acted as the icy poles of leadership, communicating in clipped, efficient terms to coordinate the complex task of opening the gate. The process was a nerve-wracking puzzle, requiring them to split into teams and activate panels and levers in different parts of the silo's humming, groaning machinery, all in perfect synchronization. The tension was thick enough to taste. After a grueling 6 hours, a deep, resonant clang echoed from the silo's depths. A massive, gear-shaped door, 10 feet in diameter and covered in glowing blue runes, began to retract into the floor, revealing a gaping black archway. A wave of cool, dry air washed over them, carrying the scent of old paper, leather, and dust. "That's it," Anya breathed, her voice a mix of awe and terror. "Level 906, the Silent Archives." "All right, here are the new rules," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "From this point on, there is no talking. None, not a word. You communicate with hand signals, you watch your step, you don't touch anything you don't have to. The things that live in here, we call them librarians. They are tall, skinny, and completely blind, but their hearing is supernatural. They can hear a pin drop from a mile away. You make a sound louder than the rustling of a page, and they will be on you before you can scream. And you won't have time to scream. Understood?" Everyone nodded, their faces grim. The archway seemed to swallow the light. One by one, they stepped through. The change was instantaneous and absolute. They were in a library of such impossible scale it defied comprehension. Bookshelves carved from a dark, polished wood stretched upwards for thousands of feet, disappearing into a darkness so complete it felt like a solid ceiling. Aisles were the size of city streets, and massive reading tables, large enough to seat giants, were scattered throughout. A faint, ambient light, seemingly emanating from the books themselves, cast a soft, dusty glow over everything. But the most overwhelming feature was the silence. It was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered sound. Lucas could feel the beat of his own heart as a dull thud in his chest, and the soft scuff of his boots on the marble floor sounded like an act of violence. He saw one of them almost immediately. High above, clinging to a bookshelf like a praying mantis, was a long, slender silhouette. It moved with an unnatural, fluid grace, its long limbs unfolding as it crawled from one shelf to another, its featureless head tilting back and forth, listening. Always listening. Sarah put a finger to her lips, then pointed down a long central aisle. She made a series of quick, precise hand signals. "Follow me. Single file. Watch for loose floorboards. Stay off the carpets. They muffle our steps, but they rustle." They began to move, a silent procession of ghosts through a dead city of knowledge. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of clothing was a thunderclap of terror. Lucas, the former archivist, was now a trespasser in the ultimate library, a place where his old world had been twisted into a hunting ground. The irony was a cold, logical observation in his mind, but for the others, the psychological pressure was immense. This was a new kind of hell, where the greatest threat was a single, careless sound. Chapter 37, A Debt Repaid. Their journey through the Silent Archives was the most psychologically grueling ordeal they had yet endured. They moved for what felt like hours, a tight, nervous cluster of shadows in a world built for silent giants. The sheer, oppressive scale of the place was designed to make them feel insignificant, and the constant threat of the librarians kept their nerves stretched to the breaking point. Lucas and Sarah, both hardened by their respective trials, moved with a fluid predator's grace. Kaido and Reese as scouts were hyper-alert, pointing out potential hazards, but Ben and Chloe were struggling. The constant, high-stakes tension was wearing them down, their movements becoming clumsy with fear. They were crossing a vast, open atrium, a circular space where multiple aisles converged. The ceiling was lost in an inky blackness hundreds of feet above, and the air felt dangerously open. In the center of the atrium stood a massive, petrified wooden card catalog, its drawers sealed with age. They had to navigate around it to reach the corridor Sarah had identified as their route. As they moved along the edge of the open space, Chloe, her eyes wide with terror as she scanned the high shelves, caught her foot on an uneven marble tile. She didn't fall loudly. It was a stumble, a muffled cry of surprise swallowed by her own hand. But in her desperate attempt to regain her balance, she knocked against a tall, bronze reading lamp left beside one of the giant tables. Time seemed to slow down. The lamp wobbled for a heart-stopping second, then crashed to the floor. The sound was a cataclysm, a deafening, echoing clang of metal on marble that shattered the sacred silence. It was a dinner bell. Instantly from the darkness above came the response, a frantic, collective rustling like 1,000 dead leaves skittering in a hurricane. From every direction the long, slender forms of the librarians began to descend, their movements silent but terrifyingly fast. They didn't fall. They crawled down the shelves, their limbs contorting at impossible angles, their featureless heads all cocked in the direction of the sound. There were dozens of them. Ben pulled Chloe behind him, his face a mask of pure horror. Alara drew her knife, a useless gesture. They were frozen, paralyzed by the sight of their imminent, silent death. But Sarah was not. In the split second the others were paralyzed. Her mind, forged in the crucible of absolute pragmatism, had already calculated the odds and found a solution. She didn't shout a warning. She didn't hesitate. With a surge of adrenaline, she lunged toward a heavy, wheeled metal cart used for transporting books. With a grunt of effort that was lost in the echo of the fallen lamp, she shoved it with all her strength down an intersecting aisle, away from the group. The cart, laden with several massive, leather-bound tomes, careened down the marble corridor, its metal wheels shrieking in protest. It slammed into a bookshelf at the far end with a final, booming crash that was 10 times louder than the lamp. The effect on the librarians was immediate and absolute, every single one of them. Some only feet from the group changed direction mid-descent. They became a silent, flowing river of black, swarming toward the new, louder sound. It was a perfect diversion. "Go now," Sarah hissed, the first word spoken since they had entered the level. Her voice was a raw, urgent command that broke their paralysis. She grabbed a stunned Chloe by the arm and shoved her forward, propelling the group into a frantic but blessedly quiet retreat down their intended corridor. They didn't stop until they found refuge in a small, soundproof study room, barricading the door behind them. They collapsed, gasping in the sudden safety. Ben was holding a sobbing Chloe. Kaido leaned against a wall, his eyes closed. But Alara was staring at Sarah, her expression a complex mixture of shock, confusion, and a dawning, grudging respect. Sarah had just saved Chloe's life, and by extension all of them. The debt from level 1, in its own strange, violent way, had just been repaid. Chapter 38. The Nature of the Bargain. Inside the small, oak-paneled study, the silence was different. It was a comforting, solid thing, the thick wooden door blocking out the terrifying emptiness of the archives. For a long time no one spoke. The aftermath of their near-death experience hung heavy in the air. Finally, Ben looked over at Sarah, his eyes red-rimmed but filled with a raw, undeniable gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. Chloe, still trembling, echoed his sentiment with a grateful nod. Sarah just gave a curt, dismissive shrug, already cleaning her rifle. She was a liability. Her noise compromised the group. I contained the threat. Her words were cold, pragmatic, stripping the heroism from her act and reducing it to a simple tactical decision. But Alara, watching her, saw something else in the slight tremor in her hands, the lingering adrenaline of a choice made on pure instinct. Later, as the others settled into an uneasy, watchful rest, Sarah cornered Lucas. He was standing by a heavy desk, running his fingers over the spine of a book, a forgotten habit from a forgotten life. "I heard whispers," Sarah began, her voice a low conspiratorial murmur that wouldn't carry past the door. "From other wanderers I met before they got unlucky, stories about level 5, about the hotel and the thing in the boiler room. They said it makes deals." She paused, her eyes boring into him. "I heard what happened at Glopen. My crew ran into another of your survivors, a kid named Liam, before a hound got him. He told us the whole story. He told us what you did to save your medic." She nodded her head slightly in Alara's direction, where she was sleeping fitfully. Lucas turned to face her, his expression impassive. He neither confirmed nor denied it. He simply waited. "You don't feel a thing, do you?" Sarah continued, her voice a strange mix of accusation and bitter fascination. "When you looked at me back in the silo, I was ready for a fight. I was ready for you to try and kill me for what I did, but there was nothing. No anger, no fear, not even recognition, just analysis." She took a step closer. "That's how you got so good at this, isn't it? That's how you became a leader. You cut out the part of you that gets you killed, the fear, the hesitation, the grief." Lucas remained silent, his stillness a tacit confirmation. "I had to learn to live with it," she whispered, her voice raw with a sudden, unexpected vulnerability. Her hand went to the scar on her face, a reflexive gesture. "I remember every choice I made. I remember being hungry enough to kill for that water. I remember the faces of the people I couldn't save. I carry all of it. It's heavy and it's ugly, but it's what keeps me sharp. It's what makes me me." She looked him up and down, a flicker of something that might have been pity in her hard eyes. "You just deleted the file. You traded your pain for their lives, and now you're an empty fortress. I have to wonder, Lucas, who really paid the higher price?" Her question was not an attack. It was a philosophical dagger slid perfectly between his ribs. It didn't cause him pain, he had none to feel, but it triggered a cascade of logic in his mind. Price, value, sacrifice, humanity. These were variables he had not considered. He was a perfect survival machine, but Sarah's words presented a chilling, undeniable truth. A machine, no matter how efficient, is still just a machine. He had won their survival, but she was suggesting he had lost the very thing they were all fighting to preserve. For the first time, a logical paradox bloomed in the quiet void of his mind, a question his machine-like consciousness could not immediately solve. Chapter 39. One Final Betrayal. After a few hours of tense rest, Kaido and Reese, scouting ahead in short, silent loops, found it. They returned to the study, their faces pale, and sketched a map on a dusty tabletop. The exit was visible, a single, modern, reinforced steel door at the far end of the archive's main hall, a stark anachronism, just like the silo had been in the fields. It was their way out. But there was a problem, a very large one. "It's being guarded," Kaido explained through a series of grim hand signals, which Sarah translated for her group in a barely audible whisper. "One of them, but it's different, bigger, older." They crept to the edge of the main hall to see for themselves. At the far end, perhaps 200 yards away, was the steel door. Seated directly in front of it was a librarian of terrifying proportions. It was easily 15 feet tall even when seated on its throne-like chair, which seemed to be constructed of thousands of fused, petrified books. Its limbs were thicker, its featureless face ancient and wrinkled like old parchment. It did not move, it did not crawl the shelves. It simply sat, its massive head cocked at a slight angle, listening to the symphony of silence with an air of absolute authority. "The head librarian," Anya whispered, her technical knowledge surfacing. "MEG logs mention it, a prime entity. Its hearing isn't just acute, some survivors claimed it was borderline precognitive. It hears your intent. You can't sneak past it." Despair settled over the group. The exit was right there, a tangible promise of safety, but it might as well have been on the moon. The open marble floor between them and the door was a killing field. Any attempt to cross it would be suicide. We can't fight it, Jax grunted, his pragmatism showing. We can't sneak past it, so what's the plan? They retreated back to the relative safety of a side aisle, concealed behind a towering bookshelf. Sarah gathered Lucas, Kaido, and Anya, the strategic minds of the two groups. Her face was a mask of cold, hard calculation. The MEG reports are clear, she whispered, her voice barely a breath of air. Its focus is singular. It can only process one major acoustic event at a time. The principle of the diversion will work. Like with the cart, Elara asked, having joined the huddle. We could try that again. No, Sarah said, her eyes flinty. A cart is a single, short-lived event. It will be back on us in seconds. To get everyone across that floor, we need a diversion that is loud, sustained, and most importantly, draws its full, undivided attention. It needs to be a threat it cannot ignore. She looked from face to face, her expression unyielding. One group can make it through that door, if the other group creates that diversion. The implication was horrifyingly clear. It was a death sentence. She was proposing to sacrifice half of them for the survival of the other half. Elara and Kaido stared at her, horrified, the fragile trust that had been built now completely shattered. This was the Sarah from level 1, the ruthless survivor who would do anything, sacrifice anyone to take the next step. Lucas watched her, his face impassive, recognizing the brutal, cold logic. It was a decision he himself might have made before. But then he saw who she was looking at. Her gaze wasn't on his group. It was on her own followers, Jax, Anya, and Reese. She was preparing to sacrifice her own. Chapter 40, The Wanderer's Choice. The silence in the aisle was suffocating, filled with the weight of Sarah's monstrous proposition. Jax, Anya, and Reese looked at their leader, their expressions a mixture of ingrained loyalty and dawning horror. They had followed her, trusted her, and now they were being weighed on the scales of survival and found wanting. They are good soldiers, Sarah whispered, her voice as sharp and cold as flaked steel. She was not talking to them but to Lucas, justifying the unjustifiable. They know the rules of this place. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. My team, we are the diversion. Your group has the medic. You have the numbers. You have the higher probability of long-term survival. It is the logical choice. She was presenting it as a noble sacrifice. But it was a unilateral execution order, dressed in the language of pragmatism. She began to raise her hand to give the signal to her team, an order they would have likely followed out of sheer discipline. No. The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. It was Lucas. He had stepped forward, placing himself directly between Sarah and her crew. Every eye turned to him. It was the first decision he had made since the bargain that felt like a direct contradiction of his programming. The logical choice was to accept Sarah's sacrifice. It was efficient. It guaranteed the survival of his people. But a flicker of something else, a ghost of an emotion, an echo of the man who had listened to Marcus's last order had surfaced. There is another way, Lucas said, his voice still flat but with a new, unyielding resonance. He pointed a steady hand towards a colossal, ancient card catalog system that stood near the center of the hall. It was made of heavy, dark oak, stood 20 feet high and looked unimaginably heavy. We do not sacrifice anyone. We work together. Sarah stared at him, her eyes narrowing. What are you talking about? A diversion has to be mobile to draw it away. Not if the diversion is overwhelming enough to paralyze it, Lucas countered. That structure is old. The wood is likely brittle at its base. With all 9 of us pushing, we can topple it. The sound of its splintering, of 1,000,000 index cards exploding across the marble, it will be an acoustic event of unprecedented scale. It will be chaos. It will be enough noise to mask our footsteps, to overload its senses for the few seconds we need to cross the floor and get through the door. It was an insane plan. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. If they weren't fast enough, the head librarian and every other librarian within a mile would descend upon them. It rejected Sarah's cold calculus for a desperate, unified hope. He looked directly at Sarah, a silent challenge in his eyes. Her entire philosophy of survival was being called into question. She could revert to her old, brutal methods, sacrificing her own loyal team to guarantee her own life. Or she could trust him. She could trust the man she had once betrayed, the empty shell of a leader, and risk everything on a single, desperate, unified act of defiance. The future of everyone in that hall rested on her choice. Her decision would define, once and for all, what kind of human she had fought so hard to remain. Chapter 41, The Pact of Noise. Sarah stared at Lucas, her expression a maelstrom of disbelief and cynical appraisal. His plan was absurd, a fool's gambit. It relied on hope, on perfect coordination, on a dozen variables they couldn't control. Her own plan was clean, brutal, and guaranteed a high probability of success for the survivors. It was the kind of choice she had taught herself to make, the kind that left scars on your soul but kept you breathing. And yet, for the first time, she hesitated. She looked at the faces of her crew, Jax, Anya, Reese, who now stared back at her, their loyalty warring with the raw terror of what she had been about to do. Then she looked at Lucas. He wasn't the terrified archivist from level 1. He wasn't even the cold, logical machine she'd met in the silo. In his eyes there was a flicker of something ancient, something she had long since buried in herself. Principle. "You're insane," she finally whispered, the words barely audible. "That's the stupidest plan I have ever heard. We'll all die." "Your plan guaranteed the death of 3, Lucas countered, his voice level. "My plan offers a statistical possibility of 0 deaths. The risk is higher, but the potential outcome is optimal for the entire group, not just a designated portion. It is the only ethical choice." The word ethical hung in the air between them, an alien concept in this world of pure survival. It was a word from the life before. Sarah let out a short, harsh breath that was almost a laugh. She had been ready to sacrifice her family, and he was giving her a lecture on ethics. The absurdity was staggering. But his absurd, illogical human plan had done something her cold pragmatism had not. It had given her crew a flicker of hope. She could see it in their eyes. She could either force them into a suicidal charge for a cause they no longer believed in, or she could stand with this strange, empty man and his impossible idea. "Fine," she hissed, the decision tearing at every instinct she had honed. "Fine, we do it your way, archivist, but if this goes wrong, I'm leaving every last one of you behind." The next few minutes were a masterclass in silent, desperate tension. They communicated in a flurry of hand signals, coordinating the assault. They would all push on the count of 3. The moment it started to tip, the fastest runners, Chloe, Ben, and Reese, would break for the door. The stronger members, Lucas, Sarah, and Jax, would give it one final, powerful shove before following. Alara, Kaido, and Anya would be right behind them. There would be no second chances. They moved into position, their feet silent on the cold marble, their hands pressing against the ancient, dusty wood of the card catalog. It was like trying to push a building. Lucas stood shoulder to shoulder with Sarah, the first time they had been in physical contact since their fight in level 1. He felt nothing, but he could feel the tremors of adrenaline running through her. He raised 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. They pushed. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The massive structure was immovable. The head librarian remained on its throne, still and silent. Then a low groan like the sound of a dying tree echoed from the base of the catalog. A crack appeared. They pushed harder, their muscles screaming, their breaths held tight in their chests. The groan became a sharp, cracking shriek. The entire structure tilted, slowly at first, then with terrifying momentum. "Now!" Sarah screamed, the sound an explosion that shattered the silence. The card catalog crashed down onto the marble floor with a cataclysmic roar of splintering wood and shattering stone. 1,000,000 paper cards burst from its drawers, a blizzard of forgotten information. The sound was apocalyptic. The head librarian shot to its feet, its featureless face turning towards the chaos, a silent scream of rage contorting its form. As it took its first step towards the wreckage, the group ran. Their feet pounded on the marble, a drumbeat of desperation completely masked by the ongoing roar. They were a blur of motion, a frantic dash across the killing floor. Lucas, bringing up the rear with Sarah, saw the librarians swarming from the high shelves, a tide of black descending on the source of the noise. They were going to make it. They were all going to make it. They burst through the steel door, slamming it shut behind them just as the first of the librarians reached the main hall. They leaned against it, hearts hammering, listening to the faint, furious rustling on the other side. They were alive. All of them. Lucas's insane, ethical plan had worked. As the adrenaline began to fade, Sarah looked at him, not with gratitude but with a new, deeply unsettling confusion. She had built her entire existence on a foundation of brutal logic, and he, the man without feelings, had just proven her wrong with a single act of reckless, illogical faith. Chapter 42: The Crimson Casino. The world on the other side of the steel door was a stark, nauseating contrast to the silent, dusty grandeur of the archives. They stumbled into a place of overwhelming sensory assault. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarette smoke, cheap perfume, and a coppery, underlying scent of old blood. A cacophony of bells, chimes, and synthetic, upbeat music blared from hundreds of sources, creating a wall of disorienting noise. Garish, flashing neon lights in reds, purples, and golds reflected endlessly off mirrored ceilings and polished brass fixtures. They were in a casino, a sprawling, opulent, and utterly deserted one. Rows of slot machines stood like silent, hungry soldiers, their screens displaying hypnotic, swirling patterns. Blackjack tables were covered in a fine layer of dust, with phantom hands of cards dealt out as if the players had simply vanished mid-game. "Level 777, Anya muttered, her hands clamped over her ears to block out the noise. "They call it Jackpot's Folly. It's a lure level. It preys on hope." "No monsters?" Ben asked, his voice trembling as he held Chloe close. "Worse," Sarah said grimly, her eyes scanning every shadow. "The level is the monster. The games are the teeth." They began to move cautiously through the labyrinth of gaming tables and slot machines. The constant noise was a form of torture, making it impossible to hear anything approaching. The flashing lights were disorienting, creating dancing shadows that looked like moving figures. The place was designed to break you down, to wear away your senses until you became desperate for a single moment of peace or a single glimmer of hope. That's when Reese, Sarah's young, nervous scout, saw it. Amidst a row of dark, silent slot machines, one was different. It glowed with a soft, inviting golden light, and the screen read in calm, simple letters, "A guaranteed winner. One pull for a way out." "Sarah, look," Reese said, his voice filled with a desperate, childlike excitement. "It's an exit. The logs never mentioned an exit like this." "Reese, get away from it," Sarah ordered, her voice sharp. "It's a trap. The level is playing with you." "But it says it's guaranteed," he pleaded. "Just one pull. What if it's real? What if we don't have to fight anymore?" He was looking at it with the eyes of a starving man looking at a feast. The psychological toll of the archives, followed by the sensory assault of the casino, had worn him down. He was desperate. Before anyone could stop him, he ran to the machine, his hands gripping the large plastic lever. "It's what you want most, isn't it?" A smooth, pleasant voice suddenly emanated from the machine's speakers. It was a voice of pure, seductive reassurance. "An easy way out. No more running, no more fear. Just pull the lever, Reese. Collect your jackpot." He looked back at the group, his face torn between his leader's command and the machine's promise. He saw the terror in their eyes and mistook it for a lack of faith. "I have to try," he whispered. He pulled the lever. For a second the machine lit up. The reels spun, a blur of golden sevens. Bells and chimes reached a triumphant crescendo. 3 sevens locked into place. "Jackpot" flashed on the screen. A wave of pure, unadulterated relief washed over Reese's face. He had won. He had saved them. Then the bottom of the machine opened up. It wasn't coins that poured out. It was a thick, black, tar-like substance that flowed like liquid night. It pooled around Reese's feet, and he screamed as it began to crawl up his legs, solidifying as it moved. It was like fast-drying cement, but it seemed to absorb the light, his clothes, his very skin. He was being consumed, pulled down into the machine. He reached out a hand, his face a mask of agony and betrayal. "Sarah!" he screamed. Jax lunged forward to grab him, but Sarah held him back, her face pale and grim. "It's too late, don't touch it." Rhys was consumed up to his waist, his frantic struggles useless against the encroaching darkness. His eyes, wide with terror, found Lucas's. In that last horrifying moment, he seemed to be pleading with the one person who he thought might understand the cold mechanics of the trap. Lucas met his gaze, processed the event, threat identified, victim compromised. Rescue, felt nothing. He simply watched as the black substance covered Rhys's face, silencing his screams. The last thing to disappear was his outstretched hand, which seemed to wave a final, pathetic goodbye before being sucked into the machine. The slot machine went dark. The alluring light vanished. On its screen now were two simple words: "Play again." The group stood in horrified silence, the casino's cheerful music suddenly sounding like a funeral dirge. The darker tone of their journey had been set in stone. The backrooms were no longer just testing their endurance. They were actively, sadistically, toying with their hope. Chapter 43, A Fraying Trust. The death of Rhys shattered the fragile truce between the two groups. The immediate shock curdled into a thick, poisonous atmosphere of blame and suspicion. Jax, the broad-shouldered enforcer of Sarah's crew, stood over the silent, dark slot machine, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He was a man of few words, his loyalty to his crew absolute. The loss of their youngest member had cracked his stoic facade. "This is your fault," he growled, turning to face Lucas's group. His gaze was full of undisguised hatred, settling on Ben and Chloe, who huddled together, pale and trembling. "If it wasn't for you people, we'd never have come to this level. Your weakness, your hesitation in the library, it cost us time. It wore him down." "That's not fair," Alara shot back, stepping forward, her fear eclipsed by a surge of protective anger. "Rhys made his own choice. Sarah told him to stop. We all saw it." "He was a kid," Jax roared, the sound barely audible over the casino's relentless din. "He was scared. Your group, you're soft. You talk about ethics and hope. Look what hope gets you in this place." He kicked the base of the slot machine, the metal groaning in protest. "It gets you eaten." "Enough, Jax," Sarah said, her voice dangerously quiet. She hadn't moved from where she stood, her eyes still fixed on the machine, but her authority was absolute. Jax fell silent, though his body was still coiled with rage. Sarah finally turned away from the machine, her face a mask of cold, controlled fury. But her anger wasn't directed at Lucas's group. It was directed at the level itself, at the universe that had played such a cruel trick. "It's right about one thing," she said, her voice flat. "This place feeds on weakness. It turns your emotions into weapons against you. Hope, fear, desperation. It's all just bait." She looked at what was left of their combined party. 9 had become 8. The fragile unity forged in the library was gone, replaced by the familiar, ugly math of survival. From now on, there are no more gambles. There are no more leaps of faith. We move with purpose, we ignore every distraction, and we find the exit. Anyone who deviates, anyone who hesitates, gets left behind. Those are the new rules. Her gaze lingered on Ben and Chloe, a clear, unspoken threat. Lucas stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of them. It was not a gesture of warmth, but of tactical positioning. "They are part of my unit," he stated, his voice devoid of inflection. "They will follow my commands. They will not be a liability." The standoff was thick with tension. It was Sarah's cold pragmatism versus Lucas's unfeeling but absolute sense of responsibility. Alara watched, her heart aching. The trust they had built was evaporating like water on a hot stone. They were splintering, turning on each other, and the casino's mocking, cheerful music seemed to celebrate their division. Anya, Sarah's tech specialist, who had been silently scanning the area with a small, scavenged device, suddenly spoke up, her voice cutting through the conflict. "I'm picking up a concentrated energy signature. It's different from the background noise of the machines. It's stable. It's coming from behind the cashier's cage at the far end of the main hall." For a moment everyone was silent, their personal conflict overshadowed by a shared singular goal, an exit. "That's our objective," Sarah declared, her voice leaving no room for argument. "We move. Now." They set off, no longer a unified group, but two separate, distrustful factions moving in the same direction, the ghost of Reese a cold, silent wedge between them. Chapter 44: The Shattered Puppet. The exit from the casino was a reinforced service door behind the cashier's cage. It led them into a place that was somehow more unsettling than the noisy, garish hell they had just left. The transition was abrupt. One moment they were in a casino. The next, they were standing in a child's bedroom of impossible proportions. The walls were painted a faded, peeling pink. A massive, four-poster bed with a dusty, tattered canopy stood in one corner, each post the size of a redwood tree. A child's building blocks, each the size of a washing machine, were scattered across a worn, stained carpet. They had entered a macro-vintage dollhouse, a world built for a giant, forgotten child. The air was thick with the smell of dust, rotting wood, and the faint, sweet scent of old porcelain. "What is this place?" Chloe whispered, her voice a small, terrified sound in the vast, silent room. "I don't know," Kaido admitted, his face grim as he scanned the enormous surroundings. "There's nothing like this in the MEG archives I can recall. This is uncharted." The silence was a welcome relief after the casino, but it was a heavy, watchful silence. They felt small, like mice in a giant's home. As they moved cautiously towards an enormous door on the far side of the room, they entered what appeared to be a playroom. Here, the horror of the level revealed itself. Hanging from the ceiling on thick, glistening strings were life-sized marionettes, dozens of them. They were crafted with exquisite, terrifying detail, their painted faces frozen in expressions of silent, wide-eyed terror. They were dressed in the tattered, modern clothes of wanderers. "They're not puppets," Ilara breathed, her medical training recognizing the unnervingly accurate anatomy. "They're people." They were bodies, perfectly preserved and encased in a shellac-like substance, their joints crudely augmented with metal hinges, their limbs attached to the awful strings. A low, creaking sound from above made them all look up. In the shadowy rafters something was moving. It was a grotesque creature, a nightmarish fusion of spider and puppeteer. Its body was a bulbous, porcelain doll's torso, cracked and stained, but its limbs were long, spindly, and multi-jointed like a spider's, ending in sharp, needle-like points. It moved with a horrifying, jerky grace, its head, a blank, featureless orb of porcelain, tilting as it watched them. They all froze. The creature, the marionettist, as they would later call it, seemed to ignore them, its attention focused on a new, unfinished puppet hanging in the center of the room. A fresh wave of revulsion went through them as they realized the puppet was still twitching faintly. Suddenly Ben, who had been standing beside Chloe, went rigid. His eyes glazed over, becoming distant and unfocused. He took a stiff, unnatural step forward. "Ben, what are you doing?" Chloe cried, grabbing his arm, but his arm was like steel. He turned to look at her, but it wasn't him looking out. His face was a blank mask, his movements jerky and controlled. A single, almost invisible, shimmering thread descended from the rafters, connected to the back of his neck. The marionettist had chosen a new puppet. "It's controlling him," Kaido yelled. "The strings, it's in his mind." Controlled by the entity, Ben moved with a horrifying, unnatural strength. He shoved Chloe away, sending her stumbling to the ground. Then, with that same stiff, puppet-like gait, he began walking towards a dark alcove at the side of the room. "Ben, no, fight it," Chloe screamed, scrambling to her feet to run after him. "It's a trap, Chloe, stay back," Sarah yelled, but Chloe was deaf with panic, her only focus on the man she loved being walked to his doom. She ran into the alcove after him. The moment she was inside, a heavy iron-wrought portcullis, disguised as a dollhouse decoration, slammed down, trapping them both inside. The marionettist in the rafters let out a soft, satisfied sound, like the gentle cracking of porcelain. It ignored the rest of them, its full attention now on its new acquisitions in the cage. Through the bars, they could only watch in horror. The shimmering thread detached from Ben, who collapsed to the ground, his own mind returning just in time for him to understand what had happened. He crawled to Chloe, who was pounding on the bars, her screams echoing in the vast, silent room. From the shadows of the alcove, a dozen smaller, child-sized porcelain puppets emerged, their movements jerky, their blank faces utterly terrifying. They swarmed over Ben and Chloe, not with claws or teeth, but with needles and thread and glistening jars of shellac. Their screams were mercifully short. The last thing the group saw before they forced themselves to turn and run was the shimmering threads descending from the ceiling, ready to string up the marionettist's newest prizes. They fled the room, the image of the two lovers, inseparable even in their horrific end, burned forever into their minds. Chapter 45. The Weight of Command. The loss of Ben and Chloe was a wound that cut deeper than any other. They were the last remnants of Glopin's innocence, a symbol of the life everyone had been fighting to reclaim. Their horrific end in the puppeteer's workshop plunged the remaining survivors into a grim, silent despair. Ilara was inconsolable, racked with guilt that she, the medic, could do nothing to save them. Sarah and her crew were stoic, but the brutal efficiency of the trap had shaken even their hardened resolve. No one was suffering more than Kaido. As the group's scout and historian, he had always seen himself as their guide, their source of knowledge in the chaos. The MEG logs were his shield, his map, his faith. But the dollhouse level had not been in any of the archives he had memorized. It was new, unknown territory. His knowledge had failed. He had failed to warn them, failed to protect them. The weight of that failure was crushing him. They found themselves in a new level, a seemingly endless series of rusted, narrow maintenance corridors, a place of dripping pipes and the constant hum of unseen machinery. It was a generic, nondescript hell, but for Kaido, it was a torment. Every corridor looked the same, every turn led to another identical intersection. His mapping skills were useless. "We need to head east," he would mutter, more to himself than to the group. The logs for levels with this architectural signature often have stable exits on their eastern perimeters. "There is no east, Kaido," Sarah would counter, her voice sharp with a frustration she barely concealed. "There are no cardinal directions here. There is only forward." "The logs are never wrong," Kaido insisted, his voice taking on a desperate, fervent edge. He would spend hours poring over a small, tattered notebook where he had transcribed key data, searching for a pattern that wasn't there. His confidence had been replaced by a frantic obsession. He was losing his grip, clinging to the crumbling edifice of his knowledge as the only thing keeping him sane. Lucas observed Kaido's deterioration with cold, detached analysis. Subject: Kaido. Status: mentally compromised. Cause: trauma, failure of established protocols. Probability of erratic behavior, increasing. He knew on a logical level that Kaido was becoming a liability, but the ghost of his own programming, the directive to protect his unit, remained. "Kaido," Lucas said one evening as they rested in a slightly larger junction room, "report your findings." It was an attempt to ground him, to give him a sense of purpose. Kaido looked up from his notes, his eyes wild. "It's the echoes, Lucas," he whispered, his voice conspiratorial. "Level 119, the false echoes. The logs mention it as a theoretical space, a place that mimics other levels, creates auditory lures. It's trying to trick us, to separate us. But I know the real signals, I know what to listen for. The MEG emergency beacon, a 3-pulse chime. It's faint, but I can almost hear it." Ilara placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Kaido, there's nothing there but the humming. We've all been listening." He jerked away from her touch. "You can't hear it. Your hearing isn't trained like mine. I've spent years studying this. I know what I'm talking about." His paranoia was growing, isolating him from the very people he was trying to save. Sarah watched the exchange, her hand resting on her weapon. She saw Kaido not as a grieving friend, but as a ticking time bomb. She turned to Lucas, her expression clear. He had to be dealt with. Lucas met her gaze, and for the first time a conflict arose in his processing. The logical move was to agree with Sarah, to neutralize the liability. But the memory of Kaido's steadfast guidance, his knowledge that had saved them a dozen times over, was a persistent file that he could not delete. He felt a strange, new sensation, indecision. The machine was encountering a problem it could not solve. The weight of command, he was beginning to understand, was not about making the easy, logical choice, but about navigating the impossible human ones. Chapter 46, The False Echo. The sound started a day later. It was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the constant, low-frequency hum of the maintenance tunnels. A gentle, three-pulse chime, ping, ping, ping. It was musical, clean, and utterly out of place in the rusted, industrial decay. "There, you hear it," Kaido exclaimed, shooting to his feet. His face was alight with a desperate, triumphant fire. "I told you it's the beacon, the MEG standard frequency. We're saved." The others fell silent, straining their ears. Faintly they could all hear it now. Ilara looked at Lucas, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Could he be right? "No," Sarah said immediately, her voice flat and certain. Her rifle was already raised, her eyes scanning the dark corridor from which the sound emanated. "Think, why would an emergency beacon be inside a level? They're meant to be used at exit points. This is a lure. It's the level." "You don't know that," Kaido shot back, his paranoia now directed at her. "You just don't want to believe we can be saved. You thrive on this, on the misery." "Kaido, listen to her," Lucas said, his voice calm and steady. He was trying to de-escalate, to apply logic. "The probability of this being a genuine MEG signal in an unmapped level is infinitesimally small. The probability of it being a trap is high." But Kaido was beyond logic. He had staked his entire sanity on his knowledge, on the hope that the MEG represented. The beacon was his salvation, and he would not be denied. "You're wrong, Lucas, both of you. You've been in here too long, you've forgotten what hope sounds like. I'm going to that beacon. It's the way out. It's the way home." Before anyone could react, he sprinted down the corridor towards the sound, his small flashlight beam bobbing wildly in the darkness. "Kaido, no!" Ilara screamed. He ignored her, his footsteps echoing down the metal hallway. Lucas and Sarah exchanged a look. There was no discussion. They both broke into a run after him, Jax and Anya right behind, Ilara struggling to keep up. They had to stop him before he led them all into a trap. The chiming grew louder, clearer, echoing from a large, open chamber ahead. Kaido reached it first, skidding to a halt in the center of the room. It was a massive cistern, filled with a dark, stagnant liquid. In the middle of the cistern, a small, floating buoy blinked with a soft, blue light, emitting the three-pulse chime. It looked like a genuine piece of rescue equipment. "I told you," Kaido yelled back at them, his voice echoing with joyous relief as they entered the chamber behind him. "It's real." As he took a step towards the edge of the water, the chiming stopped. The blue light went out. The surface of the dark water in the cistern began to ripple, not from a buoy but from something massive moving beneath. From the center of the pool, a fleshy, pale appendage, like a translucent anglerfish's lure, rose from the depths. It had been mimicking the beacon perfectly. The lure twitched, and from the water erupted a horror. It was a colossal, amoeba-like creature, its body a semi-translucent mass of protoplasm, filled with the dark, floating shapes of its previous victims. It had no eyes, no mouth, just a single-minded purpose. Kaido was frozen in place, his face a mask of utter devastation as he realized the truth. His hope had not saved him, it had doomed him. The creature, the Echo Eater, launched a pseudopod of its gelatinous body towards him. It moved with incredible speed, engulfing him completely. For a single, horrifying moment, they could see his screaming, struggling form suspended within the creature's translucent mass. Then he was simply gone, another dark shape added to its gruesome collection. The creature slid back beneath the water, the lure reappearing, the gentle, three-pulse chime starting up again as if nothing had happened. The trap was reset. The group stood at the edge of the cistern, stunned into silence. The last of Glopink's original scouts, their keeper of knowledge and their final connection to a structured past, was gone. Chapter 47, The Engineer's Gambit. The loss of Kaito was a strategic catastrophe. He was their historian, their navigator, their last link to the collective knowledge of the MEG. Without him, they were truly blind. The group, now reduced to 5, Lucas, Alara, Sarah, Jax, and Anya, retreated from the cistern, the cheerful mocking chime of the Echo Eater fatting behind them. The unspoken grief and terror bound them in a tense, suffocating silence. They were no longer 2 factions. They were just the desperate, dwindling remnants. Their path led them downwards, into the fiery, mechanical heart of the level. They entered a vast, multi-leveled engine room, a nightmarish cathedral of industry. Massive pistons, each the size of a bus, pumped rhythmically, generating a deafening, percussive roar. Pipes thick as tree trunks crisscrossed the space, glowing a dull, cherry red and radiating a heat so intense it was hard to breathe. The air was thick with the smell of hot metal, ozone, and steam. "This is it," Anya said, her voice barely audible over the din. She was pointing to a massive blast door at the far end of the lowest level, the only visible exit. "But it's on a maglock. We have to shut down the core to release it. It's a sequential purge. We'll have to activate 3 pressure release valves on 3 different levels in the right order within a 2-minute window." It was a complex, high-stakes puzzle in the middle of an industrial hell. Anya, the tech specialist, was their only hope. She quickly formulated a plan. "Jax, you're the strongest. You take valve A on the bottom level. It'll be the stiffest. Alara, you take valve B on the catwalk above. It's rusted, but it should turn. Sarah, you and I will go to the control room on the top level. I can override the primary coolant system from there, which is the first step. That will start the 2-minute timer. Lucas," she looked at him, her expression grim, "you're the coordinator. You'll stay in the center where you can see all 3 levels. You give the signals. Your timing has to be perfect." The plan was set. They moved to their positions, communicating with hand signals over the roar of the machinery. Lucas took his place on a central platform, a lonely conductor for a symphony of steam and steel. He watched as the others got into position, small figures in a vast, churning machine. The responsibility was immense, but he felt no pressure, only the cold, clear flow of data. Anya gave him a thumbs-up from the control room window. The sequence began. A klaxon began to blare, its piercing shriek adding to the chaos. A large digital clock on the wall began to count down from 120 seconds. Coolant override initiated. "Jax now," Lucas signaled, his voice swallowed by the noise, but his sharp, clear hand gesture was unmistakable. On the bottom floor, the hulking man put his full weight into turning the massive, red wheel of valve A. It groaned, resisting, but then began to turn, a torrent of scalding steam erupting from a nearby pipe. Valve A open, 85 seconds remaining. "Alara," Lucas signaled. On the catwalk, Alara grabbed her valve, her hands slipping on the rusted surface. She strained, her face a mask of effort. The valve wouldn't budge. "It's stuck," she screamed, her voice lost. 60 seconds remaining. Seeing her struggle, Jax, having secured his valve, made a split-second decision. He began to climb the ladder towards her catwalk, intending to help. But as he climbed, a high-pressure pipe, stressed by the changing pressure, ruptured directly above him. A jet of superheated steam, nearly invisible in the hazy air, blasted downwards. Jax didn't even have time to scream. He was cooked alive in an instant, his body falling from the ladder like a stone. 45 seconds remaining. From the control room, Anya saw what happened. She saw Alara still struggling, and she knew the sequence was about to fail. With a look of grim resolve at Sarah, she smashed the emergency release on her console and ran out of the room, heading for a secondary control panel near Alara's position. "I can vent the pressure from here," she yelled. As she reached the panel and slammed her hand on the override, a cascade of electrical sparks erupted from a damaged conduit above her. She was electrocuted, her body convulsing as she was held fast by the arc of raw power, but her final act had worked. The pressure in Alara's valve was released, 20 seconds remaining. Turn it! Lucas's command was a pure primal roar. Shocked into action, Alara gave the wheel one last, desperate turn. It spun freely. Valve B open, 10 seconds remaining. The final valve was in the control room. Sarah, her face a stone mask hiding her grief at the loss of her entire crew, turned the final key just as the clock hit 3 seconds. The klaxon stopped. The deafening roar of the engines began to wind down, and with a heavy, metallic groan, the massive blast door on the lowest level slid open. They had made it, but the cost was catastrophic. Jax and Anya, Sarah's entire crew, her family, were gone. They had won the gambit, but the victory felt like a funeral. Chapter 48, The Last Kindness. They stumbled through the blast door, leaving the noise and heat and death of the engine room behind them. The three of them, Lucas, Sarah, and Alara, were all that remained. They were a trio of ghosts, haunted by the faces of the friends they had lost. Sarah was a fortress of silent, simmering rage and grief. Lucas was an island of cold, observational stillness. Alara, the heart and medic of their group, was simply broken. The constant death, the relentless horror, had finally worn her down to the very core of her soul. The level they entered was quiet. It was a long, pristine white corridor, lined with identical, unmarked doors. The air was cool, clean, and sterile like a hospital. There was no visible threat, no entity, no trap. There was only the profound, unnerving silence and the endless repetition of the white hallway. After the chaos of the engine room, the quiet was a torment in its own right. They walked for what felt like a day. Alara's steps grew slower, her breathing shallow. She wasn't injured, not physically. Her ailment was of the spirit. She was exhausted in a way that no amount of sleep could fix. Finally, she stopped. She leaned against one of the white doors, her legs giving out from under her as she slid to the floor. "I can't," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "I can't go on." "Get up, Alara," Sarah said, her voice hard but lacking its usual bite. It was the command of a leader who had no energy left to lead. "We're not stopping here." "But I am," Alara said, a strange, sad smile on her face. She looked at her hands. "I became a medic to heal people, to fix what's broken, but you can't fix this. You can't put a bandage on your soul." She looked up at them, her eyes clear for the first time in days. "You keep running, you keep fighting, but every level is just a new kind of pain, a new way to lose someone. I'm just done losing." She reached out and opened the door she was leaning against. The room inside was not like the hallway. It was a simple, small bedroom. It contained a single bed with clean, white sheets, a small wooden nightstand, and a window. Through the window they could see a perfect, peaceful night sky filled with brilliant, twinkling stars. It was not a real sky, they knew. It was a lie, just like the rest of this place. But it was a beautiful lie. "I'm going to rest now," Alara said, her voice soft. "Just for a little while." "Alara, no," Lucas said. It wasn't a command. For the first time his voice contained a flicker of something else, a logical error, a conflict in his programming. Objective, protect the unit. Current action of unit member, self-termination. The two did not compute. This is not a valid survival strategy. She gave him that same sad, gentle smile. "Maybe survival isn't the point anymore, Lucas." She looked at him, her gaze piercing his cold, analytical facade. "You saved me. You gave up a part of yourself to do it. Don't let it be for nothing. That part you lost, find it again. Don't let this place turn you into a machine forever. That's the only way you truly lose." With a final weary sigh, she pulled herself into the room and gently closed the door. There was no click, no lock, just the soft sound of wood settling into its frame. Sarah took a step towards it, her hand raised, but then she stopped. She understood. This wasn't a death by a monster's claws or a level's trap. This was a choice. A final, quiet act of defiance against a universe that demanded endless suffering. They stood before the closed door for a long time. Then Sarah turned away. Lucas remained, staring at the white, featureless wood. Alara's last words echoed in the void of his mind, not as data, but as a directive, a final, impossible kindness from a friend who had given up. Find it again. He didn't know what it was or how to begin searching. He only knew that for the first time since the bargain, he felt a new, unfamiliar sensation, a vast, hollow ache. The logic of his world had finally encountered the concept of loss. And now they were two, the archivist who fell and the student who betrayed him, the beginning and the end. Chapter 49, Level 25, The Arcade. The white hallway ended as abruptly as it began, terminating at a set of swinging doors made of cheap wood-paneled plastic. A garish, buzzing neon sign above them flickered erratically, spelling out the words, Level 25, The Grand Arcade. Pushing through them, Lucas and Sarah were plunged back into a world of overwhelming sensory chaos, a twisted, more aggressive version of the casino. The air smelled of burnt sugar, ozone, and spilled soda, so thick it was cloying. The floor was a sticky, black and white checkerboard pattern that seemed to pulse and shift at the edge of their vision. And the noise was a physical entity, a relentless, deafening barrage of 8-bit music, digitized explosions, and the mocking, synthesized laughter of 100 different games. Rows of arcade cabinets stretched in every direction, their screens strobing with hypnotic, violent colors. They were twisted parodies of classic games, claw machines filled with twitching, live specimens of Backrooms entities, a racing game called Tunnel Run, where the track was an endless, shifting maintenance corridor, a whack-a-smiler game where the grinning faces of the entities popped up with terrifying speed. The entire place felt alive, malevolent, and designed with a singular, sadistic purpose, to break the player. "I've heard of this place," Sarah said, her voice a tight yell over the noise. "It's a terminal level, it's run by an entity, they call it the Game Master. It doesn't just kill you, it plays with you until you break." As if summoned by her words, every screen in the arcade suddenly flickered and went black. The cacophony of noise cut to an abrupt, shocking silence. Then on every screen, a simple, pixelated face appeared, a smiling, winking emoticon. A synthesized, cheerful voice, filled with an unbearable, mocking friendliness, echoed from every speaker in the room. "New players detected. Welcome wanderers to the final stage. You've survived so much to get here. The psychological warfare, the hungry monsters, the crushing despair. Impressive. You've earned a high score in suffering." The voice laughed, a horrible, glitching sound. Lucas and Sarah stood back to back in the center of the arcade, weapons ready, their eyes darting around the room. "But all games must come to an end," the Game Master continued. "And I always like to end with a co-op challenge. Let's see how well you two really work together. I've been watching your journey. The betrayal, the bargains, the sacrifices. It's been the best Let's Play I've seen in eons." The screens around them flickered to life, not with games but with images from their past. They saw Marcus, grim-faced, pulling the pin on his grenade. They saw Chloe and Ben being swarmed by the puppets. They saw Kaido, his face alight with false hope, being consumed by the Echo Eater. They saw Elara closing the door on the world. The entity was showing them a highlight reel of their pain. "What do you want?" Sarah screamed, her voice filled with a rage that had been simmering since Jax and Anya had died. "Want? I don't want anything, Sarah. I'm the house. The house always wins. I'm just here to provide the entertainment, and now it's time for the final boss battle. The rules are simple: survive." The floor beneath them began to change. The checkerboard pattern dissolved, replaced by a swirling, pixelated vortex of deep, starless black. It was the void, the raw, unmaking chaos that existed between the levels. The solid ground was shrinking, the vortex slowly closing in on the small island of floor they stood upon. "Oh, and one more thing," the Game Master's voice purred. "There's only one extra life. You'll have to decide who gets it. Happy gaming." The platform lurched violently. This wasn't a level to be solved or a monster to be fought. It was a final, rigged game, a cruel joke played by a godlike entity at the very end of their sanity. There was no escape. There was only the game and the encroaching, all-consuming void. Chapter 50, The Final Score. The platform of checkerboard tile shrank with agonizing slowness, the pixelated void consuming it inch by inch. The mocking laughter of the game master echoed around them, a constant reminder of their hopeless situation. Lucas and Sarah stood on their dwindling island of reality, the end of their long, brutal journey now just minutes away. This was it. The final screen. Final boss, all your logic, all your survival skills, they're worth 0 points here, but I'm a sporting god. I did promise you a choice, didn't I? Feel that, Alex? The voice boomed, its tone dripping with sadistic glee. That's the feeling of an unbeatable final boss. All your logic, all your survival skills, they're worth 0 points here, but I'm a sporting god. I did promise you a choice, didn't I? The platform stopped shrinking. It was now no bigger than a small table, forcing them to stand shoulder to shoulder. On the screen of the arcade cabinet directly in front of them, 2 buttons materialized, glowing brightly. One was a brilliant, angelic white. The other was a deep, vengeful red. It's the ultimate morality mechanic, the game master announced. Alex, this choice is for you. You're the star player after all. Push the white button and you will be granted the sacrifice achievement. You'll be instantly deleted into the void, but dear, sweet Sarah here, she'll be spared. I'll drop her into a relatively safe, if boring, level. She gets to live. You get a game over. Sarah stared at the screen, then at Lucas, her hard-won composure finally cracking, revealing the terrified woman beneath. Or, the voice continued, its tone becoming a conspiratorial whisper, you could push the red button. Let's call that the justice achievement. If you push that one, you get to live. I'll pull you out of here. But Sarah, oh, poor Sarah, who started this whole partnership with a little bit of betrayal, she falls. You get to watch. You get your revenge. You get to win. So what'll it be, champ? Redemption or revenge? Your final score awaits. This was the final test. A choice designed with perfect, intimate cruelty. It targeted the core of Lucas's entire journey. He could revert to the beginning, to the anger and betrayal that had defined his early survival, and finally exact a price from Sarah. It was the logical choice for self-preservation. It was his win condition. Or he could choose the other path, the illogical, emotional, human path. He looked at Sarah. He saw the scar on her face, the hardened survivor she had become. He saw the ghost of the terrified student who had fought for a sip of water. He saw the woman who had risked everything to save Chloe, who had stood ready to sacrifice her own crew because she thought it was the right thing to do. She was not a monster. She was a mirror. She was what this place made of you. And in that moment, the bargain he had made in the boiler room finally broke. The cold, logical dam that had held back his humanity cracked, and a flood of feeling, raw and overwhelming, poured into the void inside him. He felt the fiery agony of Marcus's sacrifice. He felt the profound grief for Ben and Chloe. He felt the quiet, aching loss of Kaido, and the gentle, heartbreaking peace of Alara's final choice. The pain was excruciating. It was the most alive he had felt since he first fell into this hell. Alara's last words echoed in his mind. Find it again. He had. Lucas, don't, Sarah whispered, her voice choked with tears. She had seen the change in his eyes, the return of the man she had wronged. Don't you dare. He turned to her, and for the first time he gave her a genuine, sad smile. Survival isn't the point anymore, he said, echoing Alara's final wisdom. He remembered his life as an archivist, a life spent preserving the stories of others. His own story had been one of survival, but its final chapter, he now realized, could be about something more. He turned to the console. The game master's laughter filled the air, anticipating his choice. Lucas didn't hesitate. He slammed his hand down on the brilliant white button. Achievement unlocked. Empathy. The game master's voice announced, laced with a tone of genuine surprise. The platform beneath Lucas's feet dissolved instantly. He was falling. Sarah screamed his name, reaching out for him, but he was already gone, plunging into the swirling, pixelated darkness of the void. As he fell, he looked up and saw her, safe on the remaining platform, which was now glowing with a golden light. She was alive. She would survive. And in his final moments, as the unmaking chaos of the backrooms rushed up to claim him, Lucas felt no fear. He felt no regret. He only felt the profound, painful, beautiful weight of his own restored humanity. He had lost the game, but he had won back his soul. His final score was 0, but his story was finally complete. And so the log ends, not with an escape but with a choice. A choice to reject the brutal logic of the backrooms and embrace the illogical, self-destructive, and ultimately redeeming nature of humanity. Lucas's journey through this impossible architecture was a descent into a hell that stripped him of everything: his home, his friends, his memories, and even his pain. But in the final moment, at the very end of everything, he found it again. He learned the cruelest and most important lesson the backrooms has to offer. Sometimes, the only way to truly survive is to sacrifice yourself for something more than survival. He didn't escape, he didn't win, but he remembered. And in a place designed to make you forget, remembering what it means to be human is the only victory that matters. Sarah lives, carrying the weight of his sacrifice. And Lucas, the wanderer, the archivist, is now a permanent part of the static, his story a testament to the fact that even in the deepest, darkest corners of a nightmare, a single act of empathy can shine like a sun. Thank you for following the Wanderer's log. This has been Luke's Sci-Fi Tales. Stay vigilant, stay human, and remember, every story has to end.